Hello, everyone, and welcome back to X-Ranger. Before we begin, I thought it would be interesting if each of you could leave a comment indicating which part of the world you're joining us from. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the episodes. Now let's get comfortable, relax, and start our program. I still get chills thinking about what happened in the mountains near Lincoln, Montana, about 9 years ago. I've been hunting all my life, spent thousands of hours in the wilderness, and nothing has ever shaken me like this. I've gone back and forth about sharing this for years, because I know how it sounds, but after what happened recently, I need to get this off my chest. Our hunting group was 6 people. Me, my buddy, and 2 other couples, including Steve and his wife and Miles and his wife. Steve's a serious hunter who's tracked bears for 20+ years, and Miles knows those woods like the back of his hand since his dad's property sits right near the area. We were hunting elk south of the Indian Meadows trailhead, close to Stonewall Mountain. It started as a pretty typical hunting trip. We arrived before dawn, geared up at the trailhead, and split into 3 pairs to cover more ground. The weather was unsettled that day, cloudy with gusting winds that kept shifting direction, perfect for staying undetected when approaching game, but it made everything feel off somehow. My buddy and I headed northeast, working through a section of dense timber. We were about 2 hours in, moving carefully along a rocky slope that opened into a small meadow. I was watching for elk sign when I heard it for the first time. It's hard to describe that sound accurately. The closest I can get is saying it was like a rusty gate being slowly opened, but sharper and more unnatural. It started as a low groan that quickly escalated into this high-pitched scream that seemed to cut right through the wind and trees. It was distant, maybe half a mile away, but crystal clear. My buddy froze mid-step. What the hell was that? I'd been hunting these mountains for 15 years and never heard anything like it. It wasn't an elk bugle, wasn't a mountain lion, wasn't a bear. We stood there for maybe 5 minutes, completely still, just listening, but it didn't come again. Probably just the wind moving through some dead trees or something, I said, trying to convince myself more than him. We kept moving, but more cautiously now, checking our surroundings constantly. Around noon, we circled back to our meeting spot to regroup with the others. When we got there, Steve and his wife looked visibly shaken. Miles wasn't much better. "Did you guys hear that scream earlier?" Steve asked immediately. My stomach dropped. "Yeah, about 2 hours ago. Sounded distant from where we were." Steve shook his head. "It wasn't distant for us. Whatever made that sound couldn't have been more than 50 yards away, but we couldn't see anything." Steve's wife was unusually quiet. She's normally talkative and relaxed, but she kept looking back over her shoulder toward the ridge they'd come from. Miles explained they were working a slope when they heard it. The sound had been so close that Steve immediately took out his bear spray and chambered a round in his rifle. "I've hunted black bears for 20 years. Steve said, his voice lower than usual. "That wasn't a bear. It wasn't anything I've ever heard before." What really got to me was Steve's reaction. This guy once stood his ground when a grizzly false charged him during a spring hunt. Nothing rattled him, but whatever he heard that day had him spooked. "We're heading back," Steve announced, taking the main game trail out. I was disappointed since we'd barely started hunting, but I understood their concern. My buddy and I decided to continue for a few more hours since we hadn't heard the sound again. Miles surprised me by offering to stay too. His wife would hike out with Steve and his wife. "I came for elk, not ghost stories," Miles said with a forced laugh. So the 3 of us continued hunting while the others headed back to the trailhead. Miles suggested we try a drainage about a mile west, where he'd seen fresh elk sign the previous week. I brought my bow along, as I preferred bow hunting when possible. The afternoon got darker as clouds thickened overhead. The wind was still gusting unpredictably, sometimes dying completely for a few minutes before whipping up again. We found some promising tracks in the drainage and decided to set up an ambush. Miles and my buddy took positions about 60 yards apart on one side while I moved to the opposite slope to try some calling. I settled into a natural blind formed by a fallen pine and some thick brush. Perfect spot. Good visibility of the game trail below while staying hidden. I waited about 20 minutes for everything to settle, then took out my elk call. I gave a few soft cow calls, paused for several minutes, then tried again. On my third sequence, that's when I heard it again. The same unnatural screaming sound from earlier. This time it was closer, much closer, and seemed to be coming from the ridge directly above me. Every hair on my neck stood up. The sound lasted maybe 7 or 8 seconds before stopping abruptly. I immediately signaled to Miles and my buddy, pointing uphill to indicate where I'd heard it. They both nodded. They'd heard it too. Then something strange happened. About 2 minutes after the scream, I heard movement in the trees above me. Deliberate movement, like something large working its way down the slope in my direction. I've tracked plenty of elk and deer. They move in a certain way, stopping and starting, breaking branches occasionally. This was different. It was steady, purposeful, and unnervingly quiet for its apparent size. I notched an arrow, thinking maybe an elk was actually responding to my calls. But something felt wrong. The footfalls were too heavy, too measured, and there was something else. A smell. At first I thought maybe it was just the rotting vegetation from a nearby bog, but as the movement got closer, the smell intensified. It was a powerful musky odor mixed with something like wet dog and rotting meat. The thing is, I never actually saw anything. The brush was too thick up on that slope. Whatever was moving stayed just out of sight, circling around my position rather than approaching directly. It was as if it was evaluating me, testing the situation. After about 15 tense minutes, the movement gradually faded away uphill. I waited until I was sure it was gone before moving. When I rejoined Miles and my buddy, they both looked as unnerved as I felt. "Something was stalking us," Miles said quietly. "Did you smell that?" We decided we'd had enough. The sun would be setting in a couple of hours anyway. We hiked out quickly, staying close together and frequently checking our backs. None of us wanted to be in those woods after dark. The strange thing is, we found no tracks, even though there was patchy snow on the ground, especially in the shadier areas. We couldn't find anything unusual, just some deer tracks and our own boot prints. We didn't talk much about it after that day. You tell someone you heard strange screams and got stalked by something that smells like death in the Montana wilderness, they're going to think you're crazy or pulling their leg, but it stuck with all of us. Over the next few years, I started paying more attention to local stories. A logger mentioned seeing something cross the road near Indian Meadows before dawn. Something walking upright, but definitely not human. Another hunter described finding a deer carcass wedged high in a tree fork, 15 feet off the ground. Multiple people reported that same rotten smell in specific areas of the forest, particularly around dusk. The strangest development came just last week. Miles called me up, sounding excited and freaked out at the same time. He'd been watching some documentary about unexplained phenomena when they played an audio recording of what they claimed was a Bigfoot call from the Pacific Northwest. "My wife heard it from the other room," Miles told me. "She came running in white as a sheet. Said that's exactly what we heard that day near my dad's property." I found the recording online later that night. The moment I played it, my blood ran cold. It was the same distinctive sound, that unnatural scream that started low and rose to a piercing pitch, the sound that had haunted my memory for years. I've been thinking about it constantly since then. The logging operations around Stonewall Mountain have increased dramatically in recent years. Areas that were once remote, pristine wilderness are now crisscrossed with access roads. The dense forest canopy that covered thousands of uninterrupted acres is shrinking year by year. If there is something living out there, something that's managed to stay hidden from human eyes, its habitat is disappearing, That might explain why sightings and encounters seem to be increasing. These creatures, whatever they are being pushed into smaller areas, closer to roads and hunting grounds. I'm headed back to those same woods next month for elk season. Part of me is dreading it, but another part is intensely curious. I've bought better recording equipment and a more powerful spotlight. I've mapped every reported sighting or strange encounter in the area going back 20 years. I don't know what we encountered that day. I can't explain the scream, the deliberate stalking, or why an experienced bear hunter like Steve was so disturbed that he abandoned the hunt. All I know is that something intelligent was watching us in those woods, something that responded to my elk call, something that wanted to remain unseen. And I can't shake the feeling that next time it might decide to show itself after to Story 2. Have you been debating whether to post this for months? I'm not the type who believes in monsters or goes looking for the unexplainable. I'm just a normal person who works hard, pays bills, and minds my own business. But what I saw back in September has been eating at me, and I need to get it off my chest. Maybe someone out there has seen something similar and can help me make sense of it. My name is Shannon Morgan. I work at a manufacturing plant that runs 3 shifts, and I was stuck on the late rotation that month. The drive home after my shift is about 20 miles through some dense forest. Nothing but trees pressing in from both sides of this narrow 2-lane road that cuts straight through miles of wilderness before it starts winding back toward town. That night, I was exhausted. It was a weekday, somewhere between 11 and midnight. The kind of late where the only vehicles you see are the occasional semi or another night shift worker heading home. My truck's heater was blasting because September nights get cold here, and I remember having the radio on low, just loud enough to keep me alert. The stretch of road I was on is honestly creepy at night. There's barely any shoulder, just a quick slope into a ditch, and then nothing but pine, fir, and hardwoods crowding right up to the pavement. My headlights only illuminated about 50 yards ahead, with darkness pressing in from all sides. The trees create this tunnel effect that makes you feel closed in, like the forest could swallow the road at any moment. I was heading north, probably doing about 55 miles per hour, when I caught some movement from the tree line on my right. My first thought was deer. They're constantly crossing this road, and I've had close calls before. It's almost instinct now to ease off the gas when I see any movement near the road at night. But as I slowed down, and my headlights better illuminated what was moving, I realized this wasn't a deer. It wasn't moving on 4 legs. What I saw was walking upright with a steady, deliberate stride. I first spotted it about 100 yards ahead, just where the trees meet the road. As my headlights hit it fully, I could see it was tall, much taller than any person I know. The figure had massive shoulders and was covered in what looked like dark brown hair or fur under my lights. Not patchy or uneven, but a complete covering. What really got me, what I still see when I close my eyes, were its arms. They hung lower than a human's arms should, not dragging on the ground like an ape, but definitely reaching down closer to its knees than any person's would. The proportions were just wrong. The strangest part was how it didn't react to my truck at all. You'd expect a person or even a large animal to pause, look toward the lights, maybe freeze or run away. This thing didn't break stride or even turn its head toward me. It just continued with these long, even steps across the road, like my truck wasn't even there. As it reached the center line, I got the clearest view of it. The muscular build was impossible to miss. This wasn't some lanky, thin creature. It had thickness to its body, especially in the chest and shoulders. The bulkiness reminded me of a weightlifter, but with proportions that were slightly off. Its legs looked proportioned similar to a man's, but thicker, stronger, carrying its massive frame across the asphalt in just a few strides. I'd slowed down to maybe 20 miles per hour by this point, but I didn't stop completely. I'm not sure if it was shock or self-preservation, but something told me not to stop my truck. Within seconds, it had crossed the entire road, cleared the ditch on the left side in what looked like a single step, and vanished into the tree line. It never broke its stride or showed any difficulty navigating the ditch or the thick underbrush. It just disappeared into the trees and darkness. After it was gone, I remember sitting there, still moving slowly, scanning the woods with my headlights. The road remained empty. No other movement, no other cars, no sound except for my engine and the heater fan. It was like nothing had happened, like I'd imagined the whole thing, but I didn't imagine it. It was real, and it was massive. I can't give an exact height, but it was much larger than an average man, probably around 7 feet tall at minimum. I drive a pickup truck, and I could tell that if that thing had been standing next to my vehicle, the top of my cab would have been only slightly higher than its shoulders, and its shoulders were wide enough to fill a good portion of the lane as it crossed. I drove the rest of the way home in a daze, constantly checking my mirrors and scanning the tree line. My hands were shaking on the steering wheel. When I finally pulled into my driveway, I sat there for several minutes, trying to process what I'd seen. I didn't sleep that night. I kept replaying the encounter in my mind, questioning if I had really seen what I thought I saw. The casual, deliberate way it moved haunted me. It wasn't rushing, wasn't sneaking. It moved like it belonged there, like it was just going about its business in its territory. The next morning, I almost convinced myself it had been a hunter in some kind of ghillie suit or bulky cold-weather gear. But who hunts at midnight? And no hunting gear explains the proportions, the way it moved, or how effortlessly it cleared that ditch and disappeared into dense woods. I considered driving back to that spot in daylight to look for tracks or signs, but something stopped me. A feeling deep in my gut told me I didn't want to know more, didn't want to get closer to whatever this was. And honestly, I was afraid of what I might or might not find. For weeks afterward, I requested earlier shifts so I wouldn't have to drive that road at night. When I finally had to take night shifts again, I took the long way home, an extra 40 minutes of driving just to avoid that straight stretch of forest road. I haven't told many people about this. My spouse thinks I saw a bear that was standing up momentarily. A friend suggested I was overtired, and my eyes played tricks on me, but I know what I saw. It wasn't a bear. Bears don't walk upright across entire roads with that kind of smooth gait, and I wasn't that tired. I was alert enough to drive safely, and the image was crystal clear in my headlights. The thing that keeps bothering me, beyond just what it was, is how uninterested it seemed in me or my truck. Every wild animal I've encountered shows some reaction to vehicles, fear, caution, curiosity. This thing acted like my truck wasn't even there, like I was the one who didn't belong. Sometimes I wonder if it knew I was watching and deliberately ignored me. That thought actually scares me more than the idea it didn't notice me, because that would mean it was intelligent enough to make that choice, to dismiss me as not worth its concern. I've lived in this area my whole life, spent plenty of time in those woods hunting and hiking. I know what bears look like, what moose look like, what people in hunting gear look like. This wasn't any of those things. Since that night, I've found myself paying more attention to local stories. There have been rumors over the years about strange sightings in these woods, things that most people dismiss as campfire tales or mistaken identities. I never gave those stories much thought before. Now I wonder how many other people have seen what I saw, but kept quiet for fear of ridicule. Last week, I had to take the same route home at night again. As I approached that stretch of road, my entire body tensed up. I found myself slowing down well before I reached the spot where I'd seen it. My headlights swept the tree lines on both sides, and I caught myself holding my breath as I drove through. Nothing happened that night. The forest was still, no movement, except for the usual night creatures. But I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched from between the trees. It was probably just my imagination working overtime, my brain reacting to trauma. But what if it wasn't? I've started keeping a bat in my truck. It's officially there for protection if my truck breaks down, but I know the real reason. Not that a bat would do much good against something that size, that powerful. Still, it makes me feel slightly better. I'm not claiming I saw Bigfoot or some mythical monster. I'm just telling you what I saw. A large, muscular, upright walking creature covered in dark hair that crossed a remote forest road in front of my truck one night. It moved with purpose and confidence, like it owned those woods. And for all I know, maybe it does. I still drive that road when I have to. I still go to work, pay my bills, and live my normal life. But something fundamental has changed in how I see the world, especially those dark woods at night. There are things out there we don't understand, things that don't fit neatly into the boxes we've created for categorizing the natural world. Sometimes when I'm alone in the dark, I think about how that creature disappeared into the trees without a trace, how effortlessly it moved through terrain that would leave most humans stumbling and struggling. And I wonder, how long was it watching me before it decided to cross? And is it still out there, moving silently through those same woods, perhaps watching other headlights approach on dark, lonely nights? I don't have answers. All I have is what I saw. Take it for what it's worth. I'm not trying to convince anyone of anything. I'm just trying to make sense of an experience that doesn't fit into my understanding of the world. Whatever it was real. And sometimes I wonder if I'll ever see it again, or if once was more than enough. Story 3. I don't know where to start with this. I've never shared this story online before, but maybe writing it out will help me process what happened all those years ago. I still get shaky just thinking about it, and it's been almost 20 years. I was 22, working the graveyard shift at one of the mines near Cripple Creek, Colorado. Night shift paid better, and I didn't mind being alone. Hell, I preferred it. I was always a big guy, 6'5", 220 pounds of mostly muscle back then. I'd grown up in the Colorado mountains, knew every animal track, could tell a black bear from a grizzly just by how they moved through brush. Nothing in those woods scared me until that night. It was early October, cold enough that my breath came out in clouds, but not bitter yet. The mine was pretty isolated, about 11 miles from the main road, surrounded by dense forest and rocky terrain. When you're out there at 3 in the morning, it's a different world. The darkness feels alive somehow. My job that night was simple. Check the equipment, log the readings, make sure nothing was malfunctioning. I'd been doing it for almost a year, and the routine was burned into my brain. Check the pumps, record pressure levels, inspect the generators. I could do it half asleep, which was good because those overnight shifts dragged on forever. Around 3:30 that morning, I finished my checks at the farthest building, what we called the back shed, a small concrete structure that housed some of the electrical equipment. It sat about 70 yards from the main facility, separated by a gravel lot. My truck was parked between them. It was dead quiet, that deep night silence where you can hear every twig snap for what seems like miles. The moon was 3/4 full, casting enough light that I didn't need my flashlight for the walk back. The air felt different somehow, heavier. At the time, I chalked it up to an incoming storm. I remember being tired, thinking about the hot coffee waiting in my thermos back at the truck. I rounded the corner of the back shed, and that's when everything in my life changed. About 40 yards ahead of me, next to my truck, stood something. My brain couldn't process what I was seeing at first. It was massive, taller than me by at least a foot, maybe more, standing on 2 legs. My first thought was bear, but I'd seen plenty of bears stand up, and this wasn't that. Its proportions were all wrong. Its shoulders were impossibly broad, tapered down to a narrower waist. The arms hung too long, nearly to its knees. The whole thing was covered in dark hair or fur that moved slightly in the breeze. But what froze me in place was how it was standing, perfectly upright, like a human, but not a human, not even close. I couldn't see its face clearly, thank God for that. But I could tell it was looking right at me. I felt it lock onto me. For maybe 3 seconds we just stood there staring at each other across the gravel lot. Then every instinct in my body screamed at once. I've never felt fear like that before or since. It wasn't the normal fear you feel when you're in danger. It was something primal, something buried deep in our DNA that recognizes a predator that we're not supposed to encounter. I ran. I didn't think about it. My body just moved back toward the shed. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely get the key in the door. The whole time I was terrified it was right behind me, that I'd feel those long arms grab me any second. I got inside and slammed the door shut, leaning against it like it might burst open any moment. The shed had no windows, just a single bare bulb overhead and the steady hum of electrical equipment. There was an emergency phone on the wall, a direct line to the main office in town. But at that hour, nobody would be there. So I called my parents' house. My dad was my emergency contact, and he only lived about 30 minutes from the mine. When my mom answered, I couldn't even speak properly. I was hyperventilating, crying in a way I hadn't since I was a small child. "Mom," I finally managed to say, "I need Pa to come out here right now with his rifle, please." She kept asking what was wrong, if I was hurt, and all I could say was, "It wasn't a bear. Oh my God, it was huge. Is Pa coming?" I stayed on that phone with my mom for 28 minutes, according to the call log I saw later. The whole time, I was pressed against that metal door, jumping at every sound outside. The wind against the metal roof, something scraping against the gravel, a low, deep sound that might have been my imagination or might have been something else. My mom kept me talking, kept telling me my father was on his way, that everything would be okay. I didn't believe her. Nothing felt like it would ever be okay again. I kept thinking about that thing standing by my truck, how wrong it looked, how it didn't belong in this world. When I heard my dad's truck pull up outside, I nearly collapsed with relief, but I couldn't bring myself to open the door. I was that terrified. I heard him calling my name, and I shouted back, my voice cracking like a teenager's. "Pa, be careful, it might still be out there." I heard the crunch of his boots on gravel, coming closer, then his fist pounding on the door. "Son, open up. What the hell is going on?" I cracked the door, peered out. He was alone, his rifle slung over his shoulder. The lot was empty now. My truck sat undisturbed. When I stumbled out and tried to explain what I'd seen, my father's concern quickly turned to frustration. He looked around, saw nothing, and decided I must have been on drugs or having some kind of breakdown. I'd never used drugs in my life, not even weed, but he wouldn't believe me. "What exactly did you think you saw?" he kept asking, his voice getting harder each time. "It was like a man, but not a man," I tried to explain, sounding crazier with each word. "Bigger, covered in hair, standing right there by my truck looking at me." My father insisted on walking the perimeter of the buildings, his rifle ready. I followed behind him, jumping at shadows. We found nothing, no tracks, no signs. Anything had been there. The ground was too rocky and hard-packed to show footprints anyway. Finally, my father said, "You're coming home with me. You're not in any shape to work." I didn't argue. I couldn't imagine staying there another minute. But I also couldn't bear the thought of getting in my truck, the truck that thing had been standing next to. So I rode with my father, leaving my vehicle behind. On the drive home, he kept glancing at me, concern and disappointment warring on his face. "Son, I've never seen you like this," he said finally. "Maybe you need to talk to someone." I knew what he meant, a therapist, because clearly I was losing my mind. But I wasn't. That's the thing that haunts me to this day. I know what I saw. I'd spent my entire life in those mountains. I knew every animal native to Colorado. I'd seen bears, mountain lions, elk, moose, everything that should be out there. This wasn't any of those. When we got to my parents' house, My mother took one look at me and burst into tears. I must have looked terrible, pale, shaking, my eyes wild. She made me hot tea with whiskey and sat with me until dawn broke. I called in sick the next day and the next. On the third day I quit. I couldn't go back there. My boss was understanding enough, said night shifts weren't for everyone, let me believe that was all it was. I spent the next few months living with my parents, barely leaving the house. I had nightmares where I could see that thing more clearly, where it chased me through endless forest, where I could never run fast enough. My father returned to the mine site the next day to retrieve my truck. When he came back, he was quieter than usual. When I asked if he'd seen anything strange, he just shook his head and said, "The place gives me the creeps at night. I don't blame you for being spooked." It was the closest he ever came to acknowledging that something might have happened. I've spent years trying to rationalize what I saw: a bear with mange, a particularly large, deformed person, a hallucination brought on by exhaustion or carbon monoxide from equipment. But deep down, I know better. Whatever I saw that night wasn't something that's supposed to exist. It wasn't something that fits into our understanding of the world. I moved away from Cripple Creek a year later. Couldn't stand being so close. Ended up in Denver. Took a job in construction. I still work in the city. Still avoid rural areas when I can. I never go camping anymore. Never hike alone. The mountains don't feel like home the way they used to. Sometimes I see stories online about Bigfoot sightings in Colorado, and my hands start to shake. I close the browser immediately. I can't bear to read them, to see if anyone else has seen what I saw. Part of me hopes I really was crazy, that it wasn't real. Because if it was real, then it's still out there. What bothers me most isn't just the creature itself. It's the fear I felt. I've been scared before. Car accidents, bar fights, close calls on construction sites, normal fear. But what I felt that night was something else entirely, like my body recognized a danger my mind couldn't comprehend, a fear that bypassed all rational thought. It's been almost 2 decades, and I've never told this story to anyone except my parents. My father took it to his grave 3 years ago, still believing I'd imagined the whole thing. My mother never mentions it. Sometimes I wonder if I'll ever know what it was. If anyone would believe me if I tried to explain. All I know is that there are things in this world that don't make sense, things we're not meant to understand. And sometimes in the darkest part of night, when I hear the wind against my window, I wonder if it's out there, if it remembers me the way I remember it, and I lie awake until dawn, listening. Story 4. I've been hesitating to share this for months now, but I need to get it off my chest. I've always been a skeptical person, the type who needs evidence before believing in anything. Bigfoot stories always seemed like fun campfire tales to me, nothing more. That changed last summer, and I still don't have a rational explanation for what I experienced. I'm an experienced hiker, and have covered most of the popular trails in Washington state over the years. That particular day in July, I wanted some solitude, so I chose one of the less traveled paths in Olympic National Forest. The weather was perfect, not too hot, clear skies, just a slight breeze. I packed light, just water, some trail mix, a small first aid kit, and my phone for pictures and emergencies. The trail started pretty standard, well marked, though not as maintained as the touristy ones. About an hour in, it narrowed considerably as it wound deeper into the forest. The canopy grew thicker, casting everything in this emerald green light that's so typical of the Pacific Northwest. The density of the trees blocked most sounds from outside the forest, creating this pocket of silence that was broken only by bird calls and the occasional rustle of small animals. 2 hours into the hike, my legs were starting to feel the burn from some of the steeper sections. I spotted a fallen log beside the trail that looked like a perfect spot for a break. The moss covering it was soft and dry enough that I didn't mind sitting on it. I unscrewed my water bottle, took a long drink, and just sat there for a minute, catching my breath. You know that feeling when you're alone in nature and you just take a moment to appreciate everything around you? That's what I was doing. The enormous evergreens towering above me, some probably hundreds of years old, the different shades of green in the ferns and underbrush, the way sunlight filtered through the branches in these scattered beams. I wasn't even looking for anything in particular. That's when I noticed something unusual. At first, it was just a shape that didn't belong among the branches of this massive evergreen about 30 feet up. My brain tried to make sense of it. A shadow, a clump of pine cones, a large bird's nest maybe. But as my eyes adjusted and focused, I realized it was something else entirely. There was this figure crouched on one of the thicker branches. It was perfectly still, which is probably why I hadn't noticed it immediately. What caught my attention was the color, a dark, rich brown that stood out against the green needles and grey-brown bark. At first, I thought it might be a bear, but the posture was all wrong. Bears don't perch on branches like that. As I stared, trying to process what I was seeing, more details became clear. It was covered in what looked like hair or fur, not patchy like mange, but a full, thick coat that rippled slightly in the breeze. Its arms were what struck me as most bizarre. They were disproportionately long and muscular, gripping the branch with hands that seemed more dexterous than any animal should have. The body was massive, even hunched over on the branch. I could tell this thing was huge, easily 6 to 7 feet tall if it stood upright. And then there were the eyes. I can't emphasize enough how unsettling it was when I realized those eyes were fixed directly on me. They caught the scattered sunlight in a way that made them gleam, not with the reflection you see in nocturnal animals, but with an intelligence that made my skin crawl. They were deep-set under a prominent brow, watching me with what I can only describe as calculated interest. I froze. My water bottle was still in my hand, half raised to my mouth. I'm not sure if it was fear or shock, but I couldn't move. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. Time seemed to stretch out forever as we just observed each other. It's hard to explain the feeling of making eye contact with something you can't identify. There was this mutual acknowledgement happening. I was seeing it, and it was very deliberately seeing me. This wasn't a random animal sighting. Whatever this was, it was studying me as intensely as I was studying it. For about 30 seconds, though it felt much longer, we remained in this strange standoff. I kept thinking maybe my eyes were playing tricks on me, that if I blinked or looked away, the shape would resolve into something ordinary, a shadow, a clump of moss, anything normal. Then it moved. The movement wasn't startled or alarmed. It was deliberate, almost like it was shifting to get a better look at me. The massive branch, which had to be at least a foot thick, actually bent slightly under its weight as it adjusted its position. What struck me was how at ease it seemed up there, balanced perfectly despite its size, like it belonged in the trees as much as on the ground. That's when my brain finally processed what I was seeing, and the realization hit me like a punch to the gut. This matched every description I'd ever heard of Bigfoot. The size, the hair, the proportions, everything aligned with the creature I'd dismissed as myth my entire life. My mouth went dry. I couldn't even swallow. Part of me wanted to grab my phone and take a picture, but I was afraid any sudden movement might provoke it. And honestly, I was shaking so badly I doubt the picture would have come out as anything but a blur. After what felt like an eternity, the creature moved again. In one fluid motion that displayed incredible strength, it reached up to a higher branch and pulled itself upward. For something so large, it moved with surprising grace and speed. The branches creaked and swayed under its weight, and I could hear the soft sound of bark being disturbed as it climbed higher. Within seconds, it had ascended another 20 feet up into the canopy. I lost sight of it among the dense branches and needles, but I could still hear it moving, getting farther away. Small twigs and bits of bark rained down as it climbed, landing on the forest floor around me. That's when the fear really hit me. This thing had been watching me. For how long? Had it been tracking me during my hike? Had I walked right under it without noticing? The thought that it had been observing me while I remained completely unaware made me feel incredibly vulnerable. I shoved my water bottle back into my pack with trembling hands and started back down the trail, moving as quickly as I safely could. Every few steps, I'd look up, scanning the trees above me. The forest that had seemed so peaceful just minutes before now felt threatening. Every shadow among the branches could be hiding those eyes. Every rustle of leaves could be it moving parallel to my path. My mind kept racing with questions. Was it following me? Was it alone? Or were there others? What did it want? Had it been curious about me, or was I encroaching on its territory? The not knowing was almost as terrifying as the encounter itself. The hike back felt like it took forever. Every bird call made me jump. At one point, I heard a branch snap somewhere off trail, and I practically sprinted for the next 100 yards. I kept looking over my shoulder, convinced I'd see it watching me from between the trees, but there was nothing visible. When I finally reached the trailhead and my car, I was drenched in sweat that had nothing to do with the hike itself. I locked myself in my car and just sat there for a good 20 minutes, trying to calm down enough to drive. My hands wouldn't stop shaking. I kept replaying what I'd seen in my mind, testing it against logic, trying to find some explanation that made sense. Could it have been a bear? No, the proportions were all wrong, and bears don't perch in trees like that. A person in a suit, in the middle of a remote trail, 30 feet up a tree, for what purpose? Every rational explanation I could think of fell apart under scrutiny. It's been months, and I still don't have answers. I've researched similar sightings in the Olympic forest, and there are more than you'd expect. Some describe the same behavior. Bigfoot using the trees as vantage points, observing hikers from above. It makes a disturbing kind of sense. We're always looking ahead on the trail or at ground level for animals. How often do we really look up? I haven't told many people about this. My close friends think I'm joking when I bring it up, and I don't blame them. I would have reacted the same way before it happened to me. But I know what I saw that day. Those eyes watching me from the branches, the deliberate way it moved, the impossible combination of size and agility. I've been back to the Olympic forest since then, but always on the busier trails and always with other people. I can't shake the feeling that if I returned to that same spot, those same eyes would be watching me from above. The forest doesn't feel the same anymore. When I'm under those trees now, I can't help but look up, wondering what might be looking back. Story 5. I can't shake what happened last hunting season, and I don't know if I'll ever be able to explain it properly. It's been months, but I still wake up in the middle of the night, my heart racing, replaying every second of what I saw that morning. I've been hunting moose for almost 20 years now. Started going with my dad when I was just a teenager, and it became something of a yearly tradition. This particular trip was supposed to be like any other. Wake up at 4 in the morning, drive out to our usual spot about 40 miles from the nearest town, and spend the day tracking. It's a pretty isolated area, lots of hills and dense forest, perfect moose country. The morning started normal enough. It was early October, one of those crisp autumn days where your breath hangs in the air like a cloud. The temperature couldn't have been more than 35 degrees, and there was frost on the ground that crunched under my boots. I remember being extra careful as I made my way up one of the hills because the rocks were slick with morning dew and moss. I'd been out for maybe 2 hours, moving slowly through the trees and keeping my eyes peeled for any movement. The sun was just starting to filter through the pines, creating these long shadows across the forest floor. It was dead quiet, except for the occasional bird call and the sound of my own breathing. I was making my way up a particularly steep incline, using my rifle as a walking stick to help navigate the uneven ground. That's when it happened. My right foot hit a patch of wet moss covering a rock, and before I knew it, I was on my back, the wind knocked out of me. My rifle clattered to the ground beside me, and I remember feeling this sharp pain in my tailbone where I'd landed on a rock. For a couple of seconds, I just lay there trying to catch my breath, staring up at the tree canopy above me. Then I heard movement, a rustling sound coming from about 10 yards ahead of me. My hunter instincts kicked in immediately. I reached for my rifle, thinking I might have spooked a moose. I propped myself up on my elbows and looked toward the sound. That's when I saw it. At first glance, I thought I'd lucked out and stumbled upon a moose that had been bedded down in the tall grass. It was getting to its feet, and I could see the dark shape moving against the golden brown of the autumn grass. My heart started pounding with excitement. I grabbed my rifle and brought it up to my shoulder, getting ready to take the shot if I had a clean line. But as I looked through the scope, that excitement turned to confusion, and then to something else entirely. What I was looking at wasn't a moose. It's hard to describe what I saw exactly. The creature was tall, maybe 7 feet, completely covered in what looked like black fur, not just dark brown like a bear's coat can sometimes appear. This was pitch black, like midnight. Its body shape was all wrong for a bear, though. It was standing upright on 2 legs, with arms that hung down almost to its knees. But what really got me was its face. I only caught a glimpse of it as it turned to look directly at me. But it wasn't the face of any animal I've ever encountered in these woods. It had these deep-set eyes that seemed to, I don't know, register me. Not like an animal being startled by a human, but like it was actually processing what it was seeing. For what felt like forever, but was probably only a few seconds, we just stared at each other, me on the ground with my rifle half raised, and this thing standing there in the grass. I swear to God it looked surprised, like it hadn't expected me to wake up or move so quickly. There was this moment. I can't explain it properly, but it felt like recognition passed between us. Not like it knew me personally, but like it understood what I was and what the gun meant. Then I adjusted my grip on my rifle, and everything changed in an instant. The creature's posture shifted, and it let out this sound that I still hear in my nightmares. It wasn't a growl or a roar like a bear. It wasn't the grunting of a moose or the howl of a wolf. It was a scream, high-pitched and unnatural. It reminded me of those old Western movies where they'd play those stereotypical Indian war cries. But this was real, and it was coming from the throat of whatever was standing in front of me. Before I could even steady my aim, it turned and ran. And Jesus Christ, the way it moved. No bear or moose or anything I've ever seen in these woods moves like that. It was fast, impossibly fast, bounding through the underbrush and over fallen logs with this fluid grace that didn't seem possible for something its size. It ran upright on 2 legs, arms pumping at its sides, covering ground at a speed that made my blood run cold. I had a clear shot. My finger was on the trigger, the creature in my sights, but I couldn't pull it. Something stopped me. The way it looked at me, the way it moved. It was too human-like. I've hunted my whole life, taken dozens of animals, but in that moment, I knew I wasn't looking at just another animal. I don't know what it was, but I couldn't shoot it any more than I could shoot a person. Within seconds, it had disappeared into the thick forest, heading up toward the ridgeline. The screaming continued for another 30 seconds or so, growing fainter as it put distance between us. I sat there for I don't know how long, my rifle still raised, my hands shaking so badly I probably couldn't have hit anything anyway. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what I'd just seen, a bear walking on its hind legs, some kind of escaped zoo animal. But deep down, I knew it wasn't either of those things. When I finally managed to get to my feet, my legs felt like rubber. I remember checking my watch. It was only 7:45 in the morning. The whole encounter couldn't have lasted more than a minute, but it felt like everything had changed. Here's the part that really messes with me. As I replayed the scene in my head, trying to make sense of it, I realized something strange. When I first fell, I was facing uphill, away from where the creature had been. That means it must have approached me while I was on the ground. It had come closer to me, not run away. Why would it do that? The only explanation that made any sense, as crazy as it sounds, is that it came to check if I was okay, like it was concerned, and it only ran when I raised my gun. I didn't hunt anymore that day. Hell, I barely remember the hike back to my truck. My mind was just spinning with what I'd seen. I didn't tell anyone at first. What was I supposed to say? That I saw Bigfoot? That I had some kind of close encounter with a creature that's not supposed to exist? I'd be laughed out of town, but I couldn't let it go. 2 weeks later, I went back to that same spot. I told myself I was just going to hunt like normal, but I know that was a lie. I was looking for it, or at least for some evidence that what I saw was real. I didn't see the creature again that day, but I found something else. About a quarter mile from where our encounter happened, up near the ridgeline in a dense cluster of pine trees, I stumbled across what looked like a shelter of sorts. It wasn't a natural formation. Someone or something had deliberately arranged fallen branches against a rock outcropping to create a sort of lean-to. It was crude but effective, providing shelter from the wind and rain while remaining almost invisible unless you were right on top of it. Inside, the ground was packed down, like something had been spending time there. There were no personal items, no trash, nothing to indicate human presence, just this strange shelter in the middle of nowhere. I convinced myself it was probably made by other hunters or maybe hikers, but deep down, I knew better. I've been hunting these woods for decades. I know where the usual hunting blinds and camps are. This was something different. A month later, I went back again. This time, after a heavy rain, I found a track. Just one, pressed into the mud near a small creek about a half-mile from where I'd originally fallen. It was huge, easily 16 inches long, and shaped like a human footprint, but broader, with what looked like 5 toes. It was deep too, suggesting whatever made it was heavy. I'm not proud of what I did next, but I covered it up. I used a branch to sweep dirt over the print and then placed some rocks on top of it. I can't explain why I did that, except that I felt this weird protective instinct, like I didn't want anyone else to find it. Since then, I've gone back to that area 4 more times. I haven't seen the creature again, but sometimes, when the wind is right, I swear I can hear that same eerie scream echoing from the ridgeline. Each time it's been at dawn, just as the light is breaking through the trees. I don't know what I saw that morning. Logically, I want to believe it was just a bear, that my mind played tricks on me after the fall. But I know what I saw, I know what I heard, and I know that in that brief moment when our eyes met, there was intelligence there, and maybe even compassion. I still hunt, but never alone anymore, and never in that particular area. Some nights I lie awake wondering if it's still out there, if it remembers me like I remember it. And sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I hadn't reached for my gun. Would it have stayed? Would it have tried to communicate somehow? I guess I'll never know. But one thing's for certain, those woods don't feel empty to me anymore. And every time I hear a twig snap behind me when I'm out there, I can't help but turn around, half expecting to see those eyes looking back at me again. Story 6. I've never really been someone who believes in the paranormal or cryptids, but I wanted to share an experience that happened to me last summer that I still can't explain. I've mostly kept this to myself because I know how it sounds, but I need to get this off my chest. It was July of 2025, and my buddy Mark and I had been planning a camping trip for months. We both worked desk jobs in Seattle and needed a break from the constant emails and fluorescent lights. We chose a spot along the Wenatchee River in Washington, a beautiful area where the river winds through before emptying into the lake a couple miles downstream from our campsite. We found this amazing spot on a cliff overlooking the river. The view was absolutely incredible. You could see for miles along the river valley, with the mountains in the background. When we set up our tent, I remember joking that it was Instagram-worthy, though we had terrible cell service, so no posting was happening. Anyway, Saturday started out perfectly normal. We hiked during the morning, fished a bit in the afternoon, didn't catch much, and by evening we were just chilling at our campsite, having a couple beers and watching the sunset over the river. The sky was turning this amazing orange-pink color, and we were just talking about work and life. You know, the usual campfire conversations. Mark suddenly went completely silent mid-sentence. At first, I thought he was joking around, but when I looked at him, his face had gone pale. He was staring intently at something across the river, down where the tree line met the water. "Dude, hand me the binoculars," he said, not taking his eyes off whatever he was looking at. I passed them to him, and he spent maybe 30 seconds looking through them without saying a word. His hand was shaking slightly, which honestly started to freak me out. "What? What do you see?" I asked. He silently handed the binoculars to me and pointed. "Look at the edge of the trees near that fallen log." When I focused the binoculars, I nearly dropped them. Standing there, partially obscured by branches but clearly visible, was something I still struggle to describe accurately. It was standing on two legs, looking around, and it was massive. I'd estimate 8 to 10 feet tall. The proportions were all wrong for a human. Its body was incredibly wide, with long arms that hung down past its knees. The thing that really stands out in my memory was the hair covering its body. It was this dark, reddish-brown color, almost like a rusty chocolate. The hair seemed thick and matted in places, but its face and hands were more bare. Its face, God. Its face is what convinced me this wasn't a person in a suit. It had this ape-like quality, with a large, wide mouth and a slightly flattened nose that protruded a bit, similar to a gorilla or other great ape, but different somehow. More, I don't know, present, aware. I watched it through the binoculars for what felt like forever, but was probably only a minute or so. It was using its hands, which looked surprisingly dexterous, to move branches and brush around. I couldn't tell if it was looking for food or just investigating. Its movements were deliberate and careful, not clumsy at all. Then something happened that sent ice through my veins. It stopped what it was doing and slowly turned its head in our direction. I swear it looked right at us, despite us being across the river and up on the cliff. There's no way a normal animal would have noticed us at that distance. We weren't making noise, we weren't moving. After it spotted us, it ducked down quickly, not in a panicked way, but like it was trying to hide. Then, in a movement that was way too fast for something that size, it turned and sprinted into the forest on two legs. The way it ran was wrong. It was fluid and quick, but the stride length was huge. It disappeared into the trees within seconds. "Did you see that?" Mark whispered, even though the creature was long gone. I nodded, my mouth too dry to speak at first. "What the hell was that?" I think we just saw a Sasquatch," he said, not sounding like he believed his own words. We spent the next hour debating what we'd seen. Could it have been a bear standing on its hind legs? No, the proportions were all wrong, and it ran on two legs. A person in a suit? Who would be out here in the wilderness in a costume that realistic? And why? Plus, the height and width. This thing was massive in a way that would be nearly impossible to fake convincingly. As the sun fully set and darkness crept in, our campsite atmosphere changed completely. What had been a relaxing evening became tense and uncomfortable. We built our fire higher than we normally would, both of us silently acknowledging our newfound unease without wanting to say it out loud. Every single noise in the woods around us became suspect. The normal forest sounds that usually fade into the background, branches moving in the wind, small animals rustling in the underbrush, suddenly became amplified and threatening. I found myself constantly scanning the tree line with my flashlight, half expecting to see reflective eyes staring back at me. Around 10 o'clock, we heard it. Footsteps in the brush below our cliff. Heavy steps, nothing like a raccoon or even a deer would make. They came in short bursts. 3 or 4 steps, then silence. then another few steps from a slightly different direction, then silence again, like something was moving around down there, stopping to listen, then moving again. Circling. You hear that? Mark whispered, unnecessarily, as we were both sitting rigid, staring toward the sound. Yeah, I replied, my voice barely audible even to myself. The pattern continued for maybe 20 minutes. Steps, silence, steps, silence. Each time the silence fell, I found myself holding my breath, straining to hear any indication of where it might be or what it was doing. The silence was somehow worse than the sounds themselves. At one point, the steps seemed to be moving away, and I felt a momentary relief. But then they circled back, now sounding like they were directly below our cliff edge, maybe 50 yards down the steep incline. We threw more wood on the fire, making it blaze higher. I don't know if that was the right move, making ourselves more visible, but the alternative of sitting in darkness felt unthinkable. Mark grabbed his hunting knife and set it on the log beside him. I had a small hatchet we'd brought for splitting kindling, and I kept it close at hand, though realistically, what good would these tools do against something that size if it decided to come up the cliff? Around midnight, we heard a loud crack, the unmistakable sound of a substantial branch breaking. Not a twig, not a small stick, but something thick enough that the snap echoed slightly in the river valley. Whatever was down there was big and heavy. Do you think it's the same thing we saw earlier? Mark asked, his voice tight. I don't know what else it could be, I replied. There aren't any bears around here big enough to make that kind of noise. The hours crawled by in this state of heightened alertness. Neither of us suggested going to sleep. It wasn't even a consideration. We kept the fire burning high, our flashlights close at hand, and our eyes on the edge of the cliff and the surrounding trees. Sometimes the noises would stop for 30 minutes or so, and I'd start to think maybe whatever it was had moved on. Then we'd hear another heavy footstep or branches moving, and the tension would return full force. The worst moment came around 3 in the morning. We heard what I can only describe as a low, rumbling sound. Not quite a growl, not quite a grunt, coming from the bottom of the cliff. It was brief, just a few seconds, but it was unlike any animal sound I've ever heard. It had this depth to it, this resonance that seemed to vibrate in my chest. Mark and I looked at each other, and I could see my own fear reflected in his eyes. We didn't speak. What was there to say? We both knew whatever was down there wasn't normal. As the first hint of dawn finally started to lighten the eastern sky, the noises gradually stopped. By the time the sun was fully up, around 6 in the morning, birds were singing again, and the forest seemed to have returned to normal. We were exhausted, running on adrenaline and fear. Once we felt it was safe, we cautiously explored the area around our campsite, looking for any evidence of what had been there. We found some broken branches along the cliff edge, but nothing conclusive. No footprints, no hair, nothing that would prove what we'd experienced. We packed up camp without discussing it. We'd planned to stay another night, but neither of us suggested it, and neither of us questioned the decision to leave. The drive home was mostly silent, both of us lost in our thoughts. In the weeks that followed, I researched Bigfoot sightings in Washington state, particularly around the Wenatchee River area. There have been others, not many, but enough to make me feel less crazy. The descriptions match what we saw. The height, the reddish-brown hair, the way it moved. I've never been back to that spot. I still go camping, but I'm different now. I'm constantly aware of my surroundings in a way I never was before. I find myself scanning the tree lines, listening more intently to the sounds of the forest. I don't hike alone anymore. I don't know what we saw that day. Maybe there's some rational explanation that I'm missing, but I know what I saw, and I know what I heard. And that experience has fundamentally changed how I think about being alone in those woods. There are things out there that we don't understand, things that don't fit neatly into our understanding of the world, and sometimes they're watching us. Story 7. I've been debating whether to share this for a long time. Even now, 16 years later, I get goosebumps just thinking about it. I'm not someone who believes in monsters or makes up stories for attention. I was always the rational kid who needed proof for everything. But what happened that day in the woods changed something in me. I still can't explain it. This happened back when I was 13. My dad was, still is, obsessed with rock hunting and mineral collecting. He'd drag us out almost every weekend to some remote spot where he'd heard there were interesting geodes or crystals or whatever. Usually these trips were boring as hell for us kids, my two sisters, brother and me. My stepmom would try to make it fun with picnics and stuff, but honestly, watching Dad hammer at rocks for hours wasn't exactly thrilling. This particular trip was to a pretty isolated area in the mountains. I won't name the exact location, but it's a region known for its quartz deposits in the Pacific Northwest. The spot was about a 3-hour drive from our house, mostly on these winding mountain roads that made me carsick. We arrived around 10 in the morning, and Dad immediately got excited about some rock formation he spotted. While Dad was setting up his little excavation site and my stepmom was unpacking lunch, my younger sister, Jamie, she was 11 then, and I got bored. My older sister was busy with her Walkman. Yeah, this was before smartphones, and my brother was helping Dad. Jamie and I spotted what looked like a trail heading into the woods nearby. It wasn't like a proper hiking trail with markers or anything, more like a dirt bike path, kind of narrow but definitely used. I remember asking my stepmom if we could explore it, and she said yes, but to stay within shouting distance. That instruction went out the window pretty quickly. We were kids, you know. Freedom was too tempting. The trail wound through these really tall pine trees. It was summer, but under the canopy, it was cool and kind of dim. The ground was covered in pine needles, which made it soft to walk on. I remember the smell, that sharp pine scent mixed with dirt, and something else I can't quite describe. Just the smell of wilderness, I guess. We hadn't gone too far, honestly. Maybe a quarter mile, half a mile tops. I wasn't really keeping track of time or distance. The trail started to slope downward, and we could hear water running. We followed the sound and came to this small creek cutting across the path. It wasn't very wide. Maybe you could jump across it if you really tried, but the water was crystal clear and ice cold. Jamie and I took off our shoes and sat on these smooth rocks by the edge, dipping our feet in the water. It was freezing, and we kept splashing each other and laughing. I remember picking up stones from the creek bed. They were all polished smooth by the water, and some had these cool striations of different colors. I pocketed a few, thinking Dad would be impressed with my own rock hunting skills. We must have spent about 20 minutes just playing in that creek. The sun was filtering through the trees in these narrow beams, making little sparkles on the water. It was peaceful, normal, just a nice moment. Then something changed. Jamie pulled her feet out of the water first and said she was getting cold. I wanted to keep exploring further down the trail. I could see it continuing on the other side of the creek, winding up a slight hill. Something about what lay beyond that hill just tugged at my curiosity. "Let's go a bit further," I said to Jamie. That's when I noticed she seemed off. She was hugging herself, even though it wasn't that cold. She kept looking around, up at the trees, back down the trail we'd come from. "I don't want to," she said. "I want to go back." "Why? We've barely explored anything," I argued. "Dad's going to be digging for hours. Don't you want to see what's over that hill?" She shook her head. I don't like it here anymore." "What's not to like? It's just woods." "It feels wrong," she said, and I remember being annoyed by how childish she sounded. "You're being stupid," I told her. "There's nothing wrong. Look, I'll go first, and if there's anything scary, which there won't be, we can turn around." I put my shoes back on and started crossing the creek, using the larger stones as stepping points. Jamie hesitated but eventually followed. I could tell she was reluctant, but she also didn't want to be alone, and she definitely didn't want to walk back by herself. The trail on the other side of the creek was steeper. The trees were denser too, blocking out more of the sunlight. To our right was a hillside that sloped upward pretty sharply, covered in thick underbrush and trees. The trail itself curved along the base of this hill. We'd only walked about 50 yards past the creek when Jamie grabbed my arm. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. I stopped walking. "Hear what?" "I don't know. Like a crack or something." I listened but didn't hear anything except the normal forest sounds. Birds, the distant babble of the creek we'd just left, the whisper of wind through the pines. "It's just a branch falling or something," I said, trying to sound confident, even though her nervousness was starting to affect me. We continued walking, but slower now. Jamie was practically pressed against me, her hand still clutching my arm. I was about to tell her to chill out when I heard it too. A distinct snapping sound, like someone stepping on a large branch coming from up on the hillside to our right. We both stopped. I stared up into the woods, but it was too thick to see anything. "Hello?" I called out, thinking maybe it was other hikers. No response. "See, probably just an animal," I said to Jamie, but I was whispering now too. "Let's go back," she pleaded. I was about to agree when curiosity got the better of me. "Let me just see what's around this bend, and then we'll go back." The trail curved sharply ahead, following the contour of the hillside. I wanted to see what was beyond it before turning back. It's one of those decisions you replay in your mind 1,000 times afterward. We made it about 10 more steps. That's when it happened. There was a sudden, violent rustling from the hillside. Not the gentle movement of branches in the wind, but the forceful shaking of undergrowth as if something large was moving through it, fast. At first, all I registered was a dark shape moving between the trees on the slope. It was big, bigger than a person, and it was charging downhill toward the trail, toward us. Then came the sound. God, that sound, 16 years later, and I can still hear it perfectly in my head. It started as a deep growl, like what you might imagine a bear would make, but different, more guttural, more, I don't know, primal. The growl rose into something like a howl, but not like a wolf. It was higher pitched, almost like a scream, but not human, not animal either, something in between that shouldn't exist. The sound echoed through the trees, seeming to come from everywhere at once. The hairs on my arms and the back of my neck stood straight up. I felt it, physically, like electricity running through my body. The bushes and small trees on the hillside shook violently as whatever it was crashed through them. I caught only glimpses. A black mass moving with shocking speed, much faster than a human could run on that terrain. Jamie screamed. I screamed too. There was no thought involved, just pure instinct. We turned and ran. The trail suddenly seemed 100 times longer than when we'd walked it. I was in front, Jamie right behind me. I could hear her sobbing as we ran. The dirt bike trail was uneven with roots and rocks, and we were going too fast to be careful. I don't know if it was following us. I didn't dare stop to look. The sound had stopped, but that was almost worse, not knowing where it was, if it was right behind us. About halfway back to the creek, my foot caught on something, a root or a rock, and I went down hard. I hit the ground chest first, knocking the wind out of me. The pain in my ribs was immediate and sharp. Jamie helped me up, still crying, pulling at my arm. "We have to go, we have to go," she kept saying. I couldn't speak, could barely breathe, but I got up and started running again. Every breath was like being stabbed in the side, but fear is a powerful motivator. I looked back once, just a quick glance over my shoulder. The trail behind us was empty, but that didn't make me feel better. If anything, it was worse. Where had it gone? Was it circling around to cut us off? Was it watching us from the trees? We reached the creek, splashing straight through it this time, not bothering with the stepping stones. Our shoes and jeans got soaked, but we didn't care. We just needed to get back to our family, back to safety. The last quarter mile was pure agony for me. My ribs throbbed with every step, every breath, but we didn't slow down until we could see the clearing where Dad and the others were. We burst out of the tree line, sobbing and gasping for air. My stepmom was the first to spot us. The look on her face, I'll never forget it. Pure alarm. She later told me we looked like we'd seen a ghost, both white as sheets, wet, dirty, with leaves and twigs in our hair. "What happened? What's wrong?" she asked, rushing over to us. We tried to explain, both talking over each other, probably not making much sense. Dad came over, then my brother and sister. They all stared at us like we were crazy. "Something chased us," I managed to say more coherently, "on the trail. It was huge and it made this sound." "What kind of sound?" Dad asked. And I could tell he thought we were exaggerating or had scared ourselves over nothing. "Like a growl and then like a scream," Jamie said. "It was coming right at us." Dad looked skeptical. "Probably just a deer you spooked. They can make weird noises when they're startled." But I knew it wasn't a deer. I'd seen deer before. This was bigger, darker, moved differently, and that sound, no deer makes a sound like that. My stepmom noticed I was holding my side. "Are you hurt?" I nodded, and when she lifted my shirt, there was already a bruise forming where I'd hit the ground. That, at least, they couldn't dismiss. The injury was real, even if they doubted what caused us to run. Dad wanted to go check out the trail himself, but Jamie and I both freaked out at the suggestion. We begged him not to go, clutching at his arms, crying again. Something in our reaction must have convinced him we were genuinely terrified because he relented. All right. Let's pack up and head home. We can come back another day." The ride home was quiet. Jamie and I sat in the back seat, still shaken. Nobody else really understood, and after a while, they stopped asking questions when our answers remained the same. Years passed. Jamie and I talked about it sometimes, but only with each other. The rest of the family treated it like one of those childhood stories that gets exaggerated with time. Dad would occasionally joke about that time the kids got chased by Bigfoot, clearly not believing it was anything out of the ordinary. Then, about 7 years after it happened, I was watching some documentary about unexplained phenomena. They played audio recordings of what they claimed were Bigfoot vocalizations captured in the Pacific Northwest. I wasn't even paying full attention until one particular recording started playing. I froze. The hair on my arm stood up, just like that day in the woods. The sound was identical to what we'd heard, that same guttural growl rising into that unnatural howl scream. Exactly the same. I called Jamie immediately, played it for her over the phone. She started crying. The documentary mentioned the recordings came from an area about 20 miles from where we'd been that day. I've done research since then. I've read accounts from other people who've had similar experiences in those woods. Some of them describe the same sound. Some talk about feeling watched, about the unnatural quiet that falls over the forest, about the sense of dread that comes out of nowhere, just like Jamie had felt before we ever heard or saw anything. I don't know what chased us that day. I don't claim to know if Bigfoot or Sasquatch or whatever you want to call it is real. All I know is that something was in those woods. Something that moved too fast and made a sound no known animal makes. Something that 16 years later still gives me nightmares sometimes. I haven't been back to those woods. I won't go back. Some things you run from once, and you keep running for the rest of your life. Story 8. I still get cold sweats thinking about what happened to us in Big Bend back in March of 2010. I'm not someone who believes in monsters or gets spooked easily. I've spent most of my life camping, hiking, and I've had my share of wildlife encounters. Bears in Montana, a mountain lion in Colorado once. But nothing, absolutely nothing compares to what happened that night in Texas. My wife and I had been planning this trip for months. We both needed to escape the daily grind, and Big Bend had been on our bucket list for years. The isolation was the main appeal. Getting away from cell phones, email, and just reconnecting with each other and nature. We'd packed our Subaru with all the gear we needed for a week-long stay. Our 3-season tent, sleeping bags, camping stove, enough food and water, and a small hatchet I always bring for kindling. The drive south took us about 8 hours from where we lived, watching the landscape gradually change from green to the stark beauty of the Chihuahuan Desert. It was breathtaking, those massive open skies, the bizarre rock formations, and the mountains rising in the distance. The park was surprisingly empty for spring break, but we were grateful for the solitude. After checking in with the park rangers and getting our permit, we found this perfect little primitive campsite nestled in a grove of mesquite and desert willow trees. It was about half a mile from the main road, far enough to feel truly immersed in the wilderness, but not so remote that we couldn't get help if needed. At least, that's what I thought at the time. The first 2 nights were magical. We'd spend our days hiking the trails, marveling at the desert in bloom. Ocotillo with their bright red flowers, prickly pear starting to bud. In the evenings, we'd cook simple meals on our camp stove and sit outside watching the stars come out one by one until the sky was absolutely littered with them. You've never seen stars until you've seen them in a place with zero light pollution. The Milky Way was so bright it cast shadows, but that third day something felt off. I noticed it first in the afternoon when the wind suddenly died. The air felt heavy, almost oppressive. The usual desert sounds, birds, insects, the rustle of small animals in the brush, all seemed to quiet down. My wife felt it too. We cut our hike short and headed back to camp earlier than planned. The sunset that evening was blood red, painting the mountains with this eerie crimson glow. I remember thinking it looked ominous, then laughing at myself for being superstitious. We made dinner in silence, both of us feeling on edge without really understanding why. "It's just a weather change coming," my wife said, but she didn't sound convinced. We turned in early that night, around 9 o'clock. Neither of us could settle into sleep, though. I laid awake, listening to the absolute silence outside. No wind, no insects chirping, nothing. It was the kind of quiet that makes your ears strain for any sound at all. I must have finally drifted off around 11, because I remember checking my watch when I was jolted awake by something. It was 12:17 a.m. At first, I wasn't sure what had woken me. Then I heard it. A heavy, deliberate step on the dry ground outside our tent. Crunch. Pause. Crunch. My entire body went rigid. We were in mountain lion territory, but this sounded much heavier than a cat. Maybe a black bear. They weren't common in Big Bend, but not unheard of. I reached over and squeezed my wife's hand. She was already awake, her eyes wide in the darkness. We both laid completely still, listening as another step came closer to our tent. Then the breathing started, slow, deep breaths that somehow didn't sound like any animal I recognized. It was rhythmic, but ragged, with an occasional catch like a half-swallowed grunt, and it was coming from much higher up than a bear would stand. The realization hit us both at the same time. Whatever was outside our tent was enormous and standing on 2 legs. My wife's fingers dug into my palm so hard it hurt, but I barely registered the pain. My mind was racing through possibilities, each more impossible than the last. Then it happened. The roar. God, I still hear it in my nightmares. It started like distant thunder, a low rumble that you feel more than hear. But it built quickly, rising in pitch and volume until it became a scream so powerful the walls of our tent vibrated. The sound filled my entire head, rattled my ribcage, and made my ears physically hurt. It wasn't like anything I'd ever heard, not bear, not mountain lion, not anything natural. When it finally stopped, the silence seemed to ring. I could hear my wife whimpering beside me, and I realized I was holding my breath. I let it out slowly, trying to make no sound at all. The creature, I don't know what else to call it, began to move. Heavy footsteps circled our tent deliberately, like it was sizing us up. Through the thin nylon walls, I could see its massive shadow passing in front of the dim starlight. It was huge, not just tall, but broad. The The silhouette showed what looked like long arms that hung down past its knees. Every few minutes, it would stop and breathe that heavy, ragged breath. Sometimes it would make a low huffing sound like it was smelling the air. When it passed in front of our tent entrance, it roared again. This time, it was so close that I felt a blast of hot air push through the fabric of the tent. The smell hit me then, a powerful, nauseating stench that made my eyes water. It was like a mix of unwashed animal, wet fur, and something rotting. I've gutted deer and smelled bear scat, but this was different. It had an almost chemical edge to it, something primordial and wrong. My wife was silently crying now, her whole body shaking. I was desperately trying to think of what to do. Our car was parked about 50 yards away. Could we make a run for it? No. Whatever this thing was, it would catch us before we got halfway. The creature continued its circuit around our tent. Sometimes it would drag what felt like knuckles or long fingers across the ground. I could hear the scrape of something sharp against the gravelly soil. Sometimes it would stop and sniff loudly, making this wet, snorting sound that turned my stomach. Time seemed to stretch and distort. What was probably only an hour felt like an eternity. I kept checking my watch. 1:15 a.m., 1:47, 2:23. The creature never left. It just kept circling, sometimes faster, sometimes slower, but always there. At about 2:30, it did something that nearly stopped my heart. It slapped the side of the tent with what must have been an open hand. The blow was so hard that the fabric bowed inward, stopping just inches from my face. In that moment, illuminated by my watch's faint glow, I could see the outline of its hand pressed against the nylon. Enormous, with long fingers spread wide. The fingers looked too long, too articulated to be a bear's paw. My wife let out a small, strangled sound. I put my hand over her mouth, terrified that any noise might provoke the creature. With my other hand, I reached for the small hatchet I kept in my backpack near the head of our sleeping area. My fingers closed around the handle, though I knew deep down it would be useless against whatever was out there. Each time the creature passed the entrance to our tent, it would pause longer, as if it was considering whether to rip open the thin barrier between us. I found myself silently pleading, bargaining with whatever higher power might be listening. Just let us make it to morning, please. At one point, I think it was around 3 a.m., the creature crouched down by the side of the tent near my head. I could see the fabric pushing inward as it leaned closer. I swear I could make out the shape of its head pressing forward, and then, God help me, I could see its mouth opening. The growl it let out then was different from the roars. It was wet, guttural, and filled with such rage that I felt it vibrate in my chest cavity. I gripped the hatchet so hard my fingers went numb. If it came through the tent, I'd go down fighting at least. My wife was frozen beside me, her breathing so shallow I could barely tell she was alive. The creature stayed in that position for what seemed like forever, its head just inches from mine, with only the thin tent material between us. I could hear its teeth clicking together, the wet sound of its tongue or lips moving. Then finally it stood back up and resumed its pacing. The sky was just starting to lighten when the creature gave one final explosive roar that made my wife scream out loud. The sound it made was so powerful that I felt the pressure change in my ears. Then it slammed both hands against the ground with enough force to make the earth shake beneath us. I heard what sounded like frustration in that final display, like it knew dawn was coming and its time was up. The footsteps finally moved away, heavier and faster now, crashing through the brush. The sound grew distant until I couldn't hear it anymore. We didn't move for at least another hour. When the sun was fully up, casting long shadows across our campsite, I finally unzipped the tent with trembling hands and peered out. The campsite looked like a battlefield. Around our tent were footprints unlike anything I'd ever seen. Each one was at least 18 inches long, pressed deep into the gravel and dirt. They were roughly human-shaped, but wider across the ball of the foot. and with what looked like opposable big toes. The stride length between prints was massive, easily 6 to 7 feet. The tent itself bore long scratches where the creature's nails or claws had dragged across it. The dirt around the entrance was churned up as if something had been digging or pawing at it. And that smell, that horrible, musky stench, still hung in the air. We packed faster than we ever had in our lives, barely speaking. Every few seconds I'd stop and scan the surrounding trees and brush. The feeling of being watched was overwhelming. It took us less than 20 minutes to throw everything into the car. I didn't even bother folding the tent properly, just stuffed it into its bag, still dirty and covered in dew. As we pulled out of the campsite, my wife finally broke down completely, sobbing with her face in her hands. We drove straight out of Big Bend, stopping only for gas at the park station. I wanted to report what happened, but what would I say? That we were terrorized by some unknown creature that walked on 2 legs and stood at least 8 feet tall, that it had hands with long fingers and made sounds no known animal could make? They'd think we were crazy or on drugs. To this day, I've never been able to explain what happened that night. I've read about black bears, about mountain lions, about every predator native to that region. Nothing matches what we experienced. I've reluctantly looked into less conventional explanations, Bigfoot sightings, skinwalkers, things I would have laughed at before. All I know is that something intelligent and malevolent found us in that remote campsite. Something that played with us, tormented us for hours like a cat with a mouse. Something that wanted us to know it could have taken us any time it wanted, but chose not to. We've never returned to Big Bend. We rarely camp at all anymore, and to this day, I can't sleep if I hear heavy footsteps outside my window or if the night gets too quiet. Story 9. I still can't believe what I saw last December 27th. It's been months, and I've gone back and forth about posting this, but I need to tell someone who won't think I'm completely insane. My flight from Portland to Seattle got cancelled because of this massive winter storm that hit the Pacific Northwest. The airport was absolute chaos. Everyone scrambling to rebook, people sleeping on the floor, kids crying. After waiting in line for 3 hours, the airline basically told me they couldn't guarantee a flight for another 2 days. I needed to be in Seattle for my sister's wedding rehearsal the next day. No way I could miss it. So I made what was probably a stupid decision and rented a car to drive the whole way. The rental place only had this crappy little Nissan with questionable tires, but I was desperate. I started the drive around 9 in the evening, thinking I'd make it to Seattle by midnight or 1 at the latest. The highway was practically empty since most people had the good sense to stay off the roads. Snow was coming down pretty hard, but it seemed manageable at first. As I got further north, conditions got worse. The windshield wipers could barely keep up with the snow, and I had to slow way down because of black ice patches. My knuckles were white from gripping the steering wheel so tight. The heat in that piece of crap rental barely worked, so I was bundled up in my coat, scarf still wrapped around my neck, trying to stay warm while concentrating on not sliding off the road. By around 12:30 in the morning, I was somewhere between Castle Rock and Kelso on I-5. The visibility was terrible, maybe 20 feet ahead at best. My eyes were burning from staring so intensely at the road. The only thing keeping me awake was my own anxiety and the thermos of coffee I'd grabbed at the last rest stop. That's when it happened. At first, it was just a dark shape in my peripheral vision, moving from the east side of the highway toward the westbound lanes. I immediately slowed down, thinking it was some poor person trying to cross the highway, maybe a stranded motorist or something. In these conditions, I figured they must be desperate to attempt crossing the interstate. As I got closer, something felt wrong. The way this thing moved wasn't right. The interstate there has this concrete median barrier. It's like 4 or 5 feet tall. No small obstacle, especially in the snow and ice. But this, whatever it was, it didn't climb over the barrier. It didn't struggle or use its hands. It just sort of glided over it, like the barrier wasn't even there. My headlights finally caught it fully, and I felt this sick, dropping sensation in my stomach. What I saw was unmistakably a silhouette of something humanoid, but way too big to be a person. It had this massive upper body, these huge shoulders that tapered down to a narrower waist. The head was set directly on those shoulders, no real neck to speak of. The arms hung down way too low, past where a normal person's knees would be, and it was tall. So fucking tall. I'm talking at least 7 or 8 feet, maybe more. It moved with this weird, fluid stride across the westbound lanes. Not running, not hurried at all, just purposeful, like it was completely unconcerned with the blizzard or the fact that it was crossing a major interstate in the middle of the night. I hit the brakes harder, skidding a bit on the slick pavement. My heart was hammering so hard I could feel it in my throat. For a split second I thought I was hallucinating from exhaustion or something, but then I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The cars in the southbound lanes, there weren't many, but the few that were there, they were reacting too. I could see brake lights flaring up, headlights flashing. Some of them slowed way down as they approached that same spot. They saw it too. Whatever this thing was, it wasn't just in my sleep-deprived imagination. As it reached the shoulder on the west side of the highway, I could see its silhouette against these distant lights from what I think was a truck stop or gas station parking lot. The backlighting made it even more obvious how unnatural this figure was. The proportions were all wrong for a human. The shoulders too wide, the arms too long, the gait too smooth for something that big moving through deep snow. I don't know why, but I didn't stop completely. Some primal part of my brain was screaming at me to keep moving, to put distance between myself and whatever the hell that thing was. So I kept driving, but slower, my eyes locked on my rearview mirror until the shape disappeared into the tree line beside the highway. For the next hour, I drove in a state of complete terror and confusion. My hands were shaking so badly I had to pull over at one point just to get myself under control. I kept checking my mirrors, convinced that somehow this thing was following me. The rational part of my brain tried to come up with explanations. A man in a costume, a weird shadow effect from the snow, my tired mind playing tricks, but none of those explanations felt right. What I saw move across that highway with such unnatural ease wasn't human. The way it cleared that median barrier without breaking stride, that's not something a person in a costume could do. And those proportions, they matched exactly what you'd expect from the descriptions of Bigfoot or Sasquatch. The broad shoulders, the no-neck head, the long arms. I made it to Seattle around 3 in the morning, pulled into my sister's driveway, and just sat there for a long time, engine running, trying to process what I'd seen. I didn't tell my sister or anyone at the wedding about it. What was I supposed to say? Hey, by the way, I'm pretty sure I saw Bigfoot crossing I-5 last night. They'd think I was insane, but I couldn't let it go. The day after the wedding, I drove back to that same stretch of highway. I had to see it in daylight, had to confirm the layout was the way I remembered it. It was. The concrete median barrier was exactly as I recalled, about 5 feet tall, with no easy way for something to cross it without climbing. The distance from the tree line on the east to the west side was substantial. There were no bridges or overpasses in that immediate area that would explain what I saw. I even stopped at a gas station nearby and casually asked the attendant if he'd heard about anything strange happening on the highway 2 nights before. He just shrugged and said the storm had caused a lot of accidents, but nothing unusual that he knew of. I was too embarrassed to press further or be specific about what I was asking. Since that night, I've spent hours researching Bigfoot sightings in Washington and Oregon. There have been hundreds reported over the years, many along the I-5 corridor and in the forests that surround it. Some of the descriptions match exactly what I saw: the height, the broad shoulders, the long arms, the smooth gait. What bothers me the most is how casual it seemed. This wasn't some creature startled by headlights, freezing and then bolting away. This thing was crossing the interstate like it was the most normal thing in the world, completely unfazed by the cars, the weather, the exposure. It's like we were the ones out of place, not it. I've tried to convince myself that it was just a weird combination of shadows, snow, and exhaustion. But then I remember those other cars slowing down, the flashing headlights. Other people saw it too. They reacted to it. Sometimes I wonder if I should have stopped completely, maybe tried to take a picture or video. But honestly, I'm glad I didn't. There was something deeply unsettling about the way that figure moved, something that made every instinct in my body scream danger. Not because it seemed aggressive, but because it felt so utterly alien, like something that shouldn't exist in our world but does anyway, moving through it with complete confidence while we huddle in our cars, pretending we're the dominant species. I drive that route regularly now for work, and every time I approach that stretch of highway, I slow down and scan the tree line. Part of me hopes I'll see it again, just to confirm I'm not crazy. The rest of me is terrified that I will. I don't know what I saw that night. I don't know if it really was a Bigfoot or Sasquatch or whatever you want to call it. But I know it wasn't human. No human moves like that. Especially not in a blizzard, especially not over a 5-foot concrete barrier. I haven't told anyone in my real life about this. My family would think I'm nuts. My friends would never let me hear the end of it. But I know what I saw, and I know I wasn't the only one who saw it. Those other drivers, I wonder if they're out there somewhere questioning their sanity just like I am, or if they've convinced themselves it was nothing. Whatever it was that crossed I-5 that night moved through our world like it had every right to be there, like we were the intruders, not it. And maybe we are. Maybe we've just been too blind or too arrogant to notice that we've been sharing this place all along with something else, something that stays hidden except on snowy nights when most humans are smart enough to stay home. I still can't explain what I saw, and I probably never will. All I know is that I'll never look at those forests along I-5 the same way again. And whenever I hear someone dismiss Bigfoot sightings as hoaxes or hallucinations, I think about that silhouette against the distant lights, and I keep my mouth shut. Story 10. It was late August, hot as hell even after the sun went down, typical Texas summer. Me, Tom, and Rick had planned to do some night fishing at this spot we knew at the Fort Worth Nature Center, right along Lake Road. We'd been there plenty of times before. It was this perfect little area where the road ran between the swampy part of Lake Worth on one side and these dense woods from the Trinity River bottomland on the other. Good fishing spot, usually quiet, and we had it pretty much to ourselves most nights. We were teenagers then, 17 and 18, thought we knew everything. Tom had just gotten this beat-up Ford pickup from his uncle, and we were always looking for excuses to take it out. That night we loaded up our gear after dinner, just some basic fishing stuff, couple 6-packs of Dr. Pepper, none of us drank back then, and headed out around 10:30. The night was sticky, that kind of humid where your shirt sticks to your back the second you step outside. I remember the sky was really clear though. Stars everywhere once we got away from the city lights. The drive out was normal. Just us shooting the shit, talking about school starting back up in a couple weeks, girls we liked, the usual teenage boy stuff. We got to our spot around 11. It was dark as pitch out there except for our headlights. No streetlights on Lake Road back then. And the moon wasn't much help through all those trees. Tom pulled off onto this little dirt turnout, left the parking lights on so we could see what we were doing. The radio was playing something. I think it was Foghat, or maybe Bad Company, can't remember exactly. But I remember it was turned down low. Tom and I hopped out to get the tackle boxes and rods from the back while Rick stayed in the cab, fiddling with the radio, trying to find a clearer station. The mosquitoes were already finding us, and I was slapping at my neck when I noticed how quiet it had gotten. You know that feeling when something's just not right? The usual night sounds, crickets, frogs, all that, they were just gone. I remember thinking it was weird but didn't say anything. I was just reaching into the bed of the truck for my tackle box when it happened. The sound came from somewhere in the woods behind us, maybe 100 yards back. I've spent 45 years trying to find the right words to describe what we heard, and I still can't do it justice. It wasn't like anything I'd ever heard before or since. It started as this deep, guttural growl that suddenly exploded into this roar. But calling it a roar doesn't capture it. It was like a scream and a howl and a roar all mixed together, and it was loud, so loud I could feel it in my chest, like it was vibrating through the trees and even the ground under our feet. I froze completely. Tom was standing there with his flashlight pointed at the ground, not moving. Through the back window of the cab, I could see Rick's face turn toward us, his eyes wide. "What the hell was that?" Tom whispered. But before either of us could say anything more, it came again. The second roar was longer, more drawn out, and it sounded furious. There's no other word for it. It wasn't just an animal noise. There was emotion behind it. Rage, like whatever made that sound, was pissed off beyond reason. This time I could tell it was closer, like it had moved toward us in those few seconds of silence. My hands started shaking so bad I dropped the flashlight. It hit the ground and went out, leaving just Tom's light and the dim red glow from the truck's taillights. I've never felt fear like that. It was like ice water replacing all the blood in my body. My legs felt weak and my mouth went completely dry. "Get in the truck," Tom hissed. "Now!" We didn't need to be told twice. We both scrambled for the cab, abandoning the fishing gear in the bed. I practically dove through the passenger door, pushing Rick to the middle of the seat. Tom jumped in after me and fumbled with his keys. "What was that?" Rick kept saying. "What the hell was that?" "I don't know, just shut up," Tom said, his voice shaking as he tried to get the key in the ignition. That's when the third roar came. It was so close and so loud that the truck windows actually vibrated. It sounded like it was right at the edge of the trees now, maybe 50 feet away at most. This one was different, higher pitched at the end, like a challenge. I swear to God, it felt like whatever made that sound was looking right at us, like it was calling us out. Tom finally got the key in and cranked the engine. It sputtered once, and my heart nearly stopped. But then it caught. He threw it in reverse, spinning the tires on the dirt as he backed onto the road, then slammed it into drive. As we peeled out, headlights bouncing wildly across the trees, I looked out the back window. I didn't see anything moving in the darkness, but I felt something watching us. I know how that sounds, but I felt it as surely as I've felt anything in my life. We tore down Lake Road doing at least 50, way too fast for that narrow, twisty road. But none of us said a word about slowing down. Nobody spoke at all. The radio was still playing, but it just seemed like noise. All three of us were straining to hear if that sound was following us. It wasn't until we hit Highway 199 that anyone spoke. Rick finally broke the silence. "You guys know what that was?" His voice was barely above a whisper. "No idea," Tom said, his knuckles still white on the steering wheel, even though we were back in civilization with streetlights and other cars. "Mountain lion, maybe?" I suggested, knowing damn well it wasn't. I'd heard mountain lions before. They can make some hair-raising screams, but nothing like what we heard. "That wasn't no mountain lion," Rick said. "That was bigger." We drove all the way back to Tom's house in near silence, just the radio playing low. We didn't even unload the fishing gear that night, just left it in the truck. I remember sitting on Tom's back porch until almost 3 in the morning, talking in hushed voices about what we'd heard, each of us trying to convince ourselves it was something normal, something explainable. It wasn't until a few weeks later that I first heard about the Lake Worth monster. I was at the barber shop with my dad, and these two older guys were talking about something they'd seen in the newspaper back in the late 60s. Stories about some kind of creature spotted around Lake Worth. They called it the Goatman, sometimes because of its shape. I listened without saying anything, my blood running cold as they described the reports. Later, I did some digging at the library, found old newspaper clippings from '69 and '70. There had been multiple sightings around the lake. People described a large, hairy creature, sometimes walking on two legs. One report said it had thrown a tire over 40 feet from a bluff. The descriptions varied, but they all mentioned its size, 7 to 8 feet tall, and an unholy sound it made. A few months after our experience, I ran into this guy named Carl at a gas station who worked for the Parks Department. When I mentioned fishing at the nature center, he got real quiet, then asked if I'd ever heard anything strange out there. When I told him about that night, his face went pale. He told me he'd seen the creature twice. The first time was near dusk on a service road. He said it was standing in the middle of the road with its arms raised, like it was stretching. He said even in the dim light, he could see how massive its chest was, how muscular its arms were in his headlights. He said it was covered in hair, but not like a bear, more patchy, with a face that was all wrong. The second time scared him even more. He was driving out of the park after locking the gates, and something started chasing his truck. He said it kept pace with him, doing 30 miles per hour for almost a quarter mile before he managed to pull away. He quit working evening shifts after that. I've never been back to that fishing spot. Tom and Rick haven't either, as far as I know. We kind of drifted apart after high school, but whenever we do run into each other, we never bring up that night. It's like an unspoken agreement. I've spent a lot of time trying to explain what we experienced. Could have been some kind of bear, though they weren't common in that area. Maybe some kind of weird atmospheric thing that distorted the sound of a normal animal. Hell, maybe it was just some local guys messing with people. But deep down, I know what we heard wasn't normal. Nothing in nature makes a sound like that, at least nothing I want to meet. Sometimes when I can't sleep, I still hear it in my head, that roar that seemed to shake the trees, and I wonder what would have happened if we'd stayed just a minute longer, if we might have seen what made that sound. Whatever it was, it's still out there, I'm sure of it, and I won't be the one to go looking for it. Story 11. I never thought I'd be the type of person writing something like this. I've always been pretty level-headed, not one for ghost stories or believing in monsters. But what's been happening on my property for the past 10 years has completely changed how I see the world. I'm still trying to make sense of it all. It started the very first day we moved in. We'd spent all day hauling boxes, setting up beds, and trying to make the place feel like home. This property was supposed to be our dream. 5 acres backing up to timber that connects all the way to the Cascades, perfect for raising animals and getting away from city life. I remember walking out back that evening to get a feel for the land. The sun was setting, and I wanted to check out where I'd build the turkey pens. That's when I saw them, 2 red eyes staring at me from the tree line, about 75 yards from my back door. They were positioned by a shallow draw that runs through the property. At first I thought it might be a deer, or maybe even a bear, but something felt off. The eyes were too high off the ground. When I went back the next day to look around, I found some disturbed vegetation and what looked like a partial footprint in the soft earth. Based on where I'd seen those eyes and the height of the broken branches, whatever was standing there had to be around 8 feet tall. I told myself it was probably just a bear standing on its hind legs. What else could it be, right? But deep down, I knew bears don't have glowing red eyes like that. I went ahead with my plans anyway, built the house up, constructed turkey pens, and set up my little hobby farm. The turkeys were my pride and joy. I'd raised them before and knew what I was doing. But within the first month, something weird started happening. The turkeys that nested near the fence, closest to the timber, began disappearing. At first I blamed coyotes or maybe even a cougar. So I reinforced the fencing, added some barbed wire along the top, and put in motion-activated lights. Didn't help. The pattern continued. Only the birds roosting in the middle of the pen, completely out of arm's reach from any side, would survive. The rest would just vanish overnight. No blood, no feathers, nothing. just gone. About a year into living here, I set up some 3D archery targets in the yard. You know those foam animal shapes you practice shooting at? I had a deer, a bear, and a turkey. I came out one morning to find them completely destroyed, not just knocked over or shot full of holes. They were torn apart. The foam was ripped to shreds, with deep scratch marks that looked disturbingly like they were made by fingernails. There were also bite impressions all over them, similar to horse teeth, but much, much larger. I called a buddy who works as a game warden to come take a look. He was baffled, said he'd never seen anything like it. The scratch marks were too big for a bear, and the bite pattern didn't match any known predator in the area. He joked that maybe I had a Sasquatch problem. I laughed it off, but that joke's been sitting heavy on my mind ever since. The noises started in year 2. At first it was just wood knocks, like someone taking a baseball bat and smacking it against a tree trunk. They'd happen at random times, day and night. Sometimes they'd be far off in the distance. Other times so close I could swear whatever was making the sound was standing right at the edge of my yard. Then came what I call the jabbering Chinese man voices. That's the closest description I can come up with. It's like someone speaking a language I don't understand, but with a rhythm and cadence that almost sounds human, yet not quite. It's higher pitched than you'd expect from something large. The first time I heard it, I was splitting firewood near dusk. The sound came from deep in the timber, but it carried like you wouldn't believe. I dropped my axe and ran inside, heart pounding out of my chest. I've heard those voices dozens of times since then, sometimes just a short burst. Other times it goes on for minutes. My wife thinks it's just birds or coyotes making strange calls. But I know better. Birds and coyotes don't sound like they're trying to form words. The footsteps are what really get to me. Heavy, deliberate steps moving through the underbrush. When whatever it is walks, you can hear branches snapping under its weight. Sometimes it sounds like it's circling the property, going around and around, just watching. I've gone out with my rifle more times than I can count, but I never see anything. Just those sounds, moving away as soon as I step outside. 3 years ago, things escalated. I started finding items moved around on my property. Tools I'd leave out would be in different spots the next morning. Not like they'd blown in the wind. They'd be carefully placed somewhere obvious, like on top of a stump or right in the middle of the driveway. Once I left a hammer on my workbench in the open garage, and the next morning it was sitting on the hood of my truck. The rocks are the weirdest part. I'll find rocks placed on top of vehicles, on porch railings, on windowsills. Not thrown or dropped, placed deliberately. The first time I found a smooth river rock sitting on the roof of my truck, I thought one of the neighborhood kids was messing with me. But we don't really have neighbors out here, not close enough for kids to be sneaking onto my property at night. Last summer, I found the track. It had rained heavily the night before, and the ground near one of the turkey pens was soft and muddy. There it was, a footprint measuring 15 inches long and 6 inches wide. It was deeply pressed into the mud, suggesting whatever left it was extremely heavy. The impression showed what looked like 5 toes, with the big toe being offset slightly like a human foot, but much, much larger. I took photos and measurements before the rain came again and washed it away. I'm not some conspiracy nut. I don't go looking for this stuff. I've tried to find rational explanations for everything. Could be bears, could be mountain lions, could be trespassers playing elaborate pranks. But none of those explanations account for everything that's happened. This habitat connects directly to the Cascades mountain range. There are old abandoned mines scattered throughout the area, caves that go deep into the mountains, power line cuts that create perfect corridors through the wilderness. The wildlife is abundant: deer, elk, turkeys, fish in the creeks. It's the perfect place for something to live undetected, only venturing out when it needs food or gets curious. About a month ago, I had my most terrifying encounter yet. I was walking the property line at dusk, checking fences like I do every few weeks. I had this feeling like I was being watched, that prickly sensation on the back of your neck. I turned to look toward the timber, and I swear I saw something move. It was huge, at least 8 feet tall, and covered in what looked like dark hair or fur. It was standing perfectly still between 2 trees, just watching me. When it realized I'd spotted it, it moved back into the shadows so quickly I almost doubted what I'd seen. Almost. I ran back to the house, grabbed my rifle and a spotlight, and went back out with my heart hammering in my chest. I spent an hour searching that area, but found nothing. No footprints, no broken branches, no sign that anything had been there at all. That night I heard the wood knocks again, closer than ever before. 3 distinct knocks, followed by that jabbering voice sound, then 3 more knocks. It was like it was trying to communicate, taunting me for not being able to find it earlier. The next morning, I found one of my turkey's feathers placed precisely in the center of my doormat. Not a feather that had blown there by chance. It was standing upright, the quills stuck into the mat like a tiny flag. I've installed game cameras all over the property. Most nights, they don't capture anything unusual, but occasionally they stop working for no apparent reason. Batteries that should last weeks die overnight. Sometimes the cameras get turned to face in different directions, even though they're strapped securely to trees. Last week, I found all 5 cameras had been turned upside down on the same night. Not one of them captured whatever did it. I don't know what to do anymore. I'm not willing to leave. This is my home, and I've put too much work into it. But I also can't ignore that something big lives in the timber behind my house. It watches me. It takes my turkeys. It leaves marks on my targets and places rocks where it knows I'll find them. Sometimes I wake up at night and look out the bedroom window toward the tree line, and I swear I can see those same red eyes I saw on the first day, watching, waiting. For what, I don't know. Last night I heard something heavy walking on my porch. The floorboards creaked under its weight, and I could hear breathing, deep, heavy breaths, like something massive trying to be quiet and not quite managing it. I grabbed my gun and waited, frozen with fear, listening as whatever it was slowly circled the house, trying each window and door. It finally stopped outside my bedroom window and just stood there for what felt like hours. I didn't look. I couldn't bring myself to pull back the curtain. I just sat there in the dark, gun in hand, waiting for it to either leave or break in. Eventually, I heard those heavy footsteps move away, back toward the timber. This morning, I found a perfect semicircle of rocks placed around my back door. 23 smooth river rocks that definitely weren't there when I went to bed. Something is out there, something intelligent, something that wants me to know it's watching, and I have absolutely no idea what to do about it. Story 12. I've never told this story to anyone outside my family because, well, who'd believe me? But I swear on everything I hold dear that what I'm about to share is the absolute truth of what happened that summer night in 1964. I was 14 years old. We were driving back from my dad's cousin's farm near Markdale, Ontario. It was a warm June night, probably around 11 o'clock, and I was tired but couldn't sleep in the car. My parents were in the front seat, Dad driving, Mom in the passenger seat. I was sprawled across the back, staring out the window at the passing trees, just watching the shadows move. The roads out there were all gravel back then, winding through thick woods. We'd been driving for maybe 20 minutes when we rounded this curve. Dad had the headlights on, of course, and they were casting light off to the side of the road. I remember I was leaning against the right rear door, my head against the window glass, feeling the vibration of the car rumbling over the gravel. That's when I saw it. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. There was this tall figure standing on top of an embankment at the edge of the tree line. The embankment was steep, maybe 10 feet high, and this thing was just standing there, completely still, looking down at our car. The headlights weren't directly on it, but that side-cast light caught enough of its outline that I could see it clearly. It was covered in fur, dark fur, Couldn't tell you the exact color in that light, but it wasn't black. Maybe dark brown and tall. God, it was tall. Standing up there on that embankment, it looked massive. 7 feet at least, probably more. My heart practically stopped. I remember pressing my face against the glass, trying to keep it in view as we drove past. It didn't move at first, just watched us. Then, as we passed by, I twisted around in my seat to look out the rear window, and that's when it started moving. It walked, not lumbered like a bear, down that steep embankment, on 2 legs, the whole way down, completely upright like a person. It moved with this purpose. Not rushed, not scared, just deliberate. When it reached the bottom, it stepped right up to the edge of the road. I could see it even more clearly then because our brake lights were illuminating it from behind, and there was this lodge or cabin across the road that had some outdoor lights on. The creature was just standing there, watching our car drive away. My mouth went dry. I couldn't even speak for a few seconds. The way it moved was so human, but not human at all, It had these long arms that hung down past its thighs, and its body was massive, broad shoulders tapering down to a narrower waist. But it was the way it stood that got me, completely upright, confident, watching us, not hunched over like a bear trying to stand. Dad slowed down as we approached a stop sign about 300 feet down the road. That's when I finally found my voice. "Dad! Dad, stop the car! Turn around!" I was practically climbing into the front seat, pointing back behind us. "There's something back there, some kind of creature or something." Mom turned around first. "What are you talking about, honey?" "Back there, by the embankment. There's this huge, hairy thing. It was watching us, and then it came down to the road." Dad glanced in the rear-view mirror, but of course we were too far away now and around a bend in the road. "What did it look like?" Dad asked. But I could already hear the skepticism in his voice. It was huge, covered in fur, walking on 2 legs like a person. My words were tumbling out. "It has to be 7 feet tall, maybe more. Please, can we go back and look?" Mom and Dad exchanged that look parents give each other when their kid is being dramatic. I knew that look well. "Sounds like you saw a bear," Mom said gently. "They stand on their hind legs sometimes." "It wasn't a bear," I insisted. "Bears don't walk down steep hills on their hind legs. This thing walked exactly like a person, but it was covered in fur." Dad sighed. "It's late, and we're still 40 minutes from home. It was probably just someone from that lodge across the road." "Dad, no person is that big. And why would someone be covered in fur standing in the woods at 11 at night? Just turn around, please. It was right there." But Dad had already pulled through the stop sign and was continuing down the road. "Your imagination's running wild, son. It's dark. You're tired. Probably just saw a shadow that looked like something else." I slumped back in my seat, frustrated and confused. I knew what I saw. It wasn't a bear, and it certainly wasn't a person. The image was burned into my mind, that tall, fur-covered figure standing at the edge of the woods, then deliberately walking down to the road on 2 legs. The rest of the drive home was quiet. I kept replaying the sighting in my head, trying to make sense of it. Could it have been someone in a costume? But why would someone be out there in the middle of nowhere, waiting for a random car to drive by, and they didn't jump out or try to scare us? They just watched, almost like they were as curious about us as I was about them. For days afterward, I tried to convince my parents that what I'd seen was real. I drew pictures. I described it in detail. I even got some books from the library about wildlife in Ontario to prove it wasn't any known animal. But the more I pushed, the more they dismissed it as an overactive imagination. "You've been reading too many of those monster magazines," Dad would say. "Next thing you'll be telling us you saw flying saucers too." It was infuriating. I knew what I saw. I was 100% certain, and the more I thought about it, the more convinced I became that I'd seen a Sasquatch. Bigfoot. It fit all the descriptions I'd read about, Though at the time, Bigfoot wasn't as well known in popular culture as it would become later. As the summer went on, I gradually stopped bringing it up. What was the point? No one believed me, but I never forgot. Not for a single day. The image of that creature standing there watching our car, then walking down to the road, it was permanently etched in my memory. About 7 years later, when I was home from college, Dad and I were sitting on the porch one evening, just talking. Somehow the conversation drifted to childhood memories, and I mentioned that night again. You know, I still remember that thing I saw near Markdale. Still bothers me that we didn't go back to check it out. I expected the usual dismissal, but Dad got quiet. He took a sip of his beer and looked out across the yard before speaking. "When I was a kid," he said slowly, "my friends and I used to go swimming in this pond not far from my cousin's place, the same woods where you said you saw that thing." I sat up straighter, suddenly alert. "We'd hear sounds sometimes," he continued. "Strange screams, growls, not like any animal we knew. The older kids used to say it was the Markdale Monster. Stupid name, playing off the town's name. We thought they were just trying to scare us." My mouth went dry. "Why didn't you tell me this before?" He shrugged. "Didn't want to encourage your imagination, and honestly, I figured it was just older kids playing pranks on us back then." He paused. "But sometimes I wonder. That was the closest Dad ever came to acknowledging that maybe, just maybe, I'd seen something real that night. It wasn't much, but it meant something to me." Years have passed since that June night in 1964, but the memory hasn't faded at all. I can still see that creature standing there watching us pass. I've analyzed it 1,000 times in my head. No bear walks down an embankment exclusively on its hind legs like that. Not for that distance, not with that steady, deliberate gait. And few men stand 7 feet tall with that bulk and those proportions. And if it had been someone in a costume trying to pull a prank, why not make themselves more obvious? Why not jump out at the car or make some noise? Why just stand there and watch us pass, then walk down to the road after we'd gone by? It makes no sense as a hoax. I've driven back through that area many times as an adult. The road's paved now, and there are more houses. The lodge across from where I saw the creature is gone, replaced by a couple of vacation homes. The embankment is still there, though not as steep as I remember. The woods are thinner now too, logged out in some areas. I always slow down at that curve, always look up at that spot by the tree line. I've never seen anything again, but sometimes, especially at dusk, I get this feeling of being watched. The hairs on the back of my neck stand up, and I get that same dry-mouthed feeling I had as a teenager. Whatever I saw that night near Markdale was real. I've never doubted that for a second. Not a bear, not a person. Something else. Something that wasn't supposed to be there, or maybe something that was there long before we were. I'm in my 70s now, and I've never had another sighting, but I still think about it all the time. What was it doing there? Where did it go? Are there more of them? Sometimes I wonder if it remembers seeing our car that night as clearly as I remember seeing it. That brief encounter changed me, made me question what I thought I knew about the world, made me realize there are things out there we don't understand, things that stay hidden most of the time, just glimpsed for a moment when the conditions are just right. A pair of headlights catching something at the edge of the woods on a clear June night near Markdale, Ontario. I know what I saw, and nothing will ever convince me otherwise. Story 13. I've owned this little piece of land for about 15 years now. Nothing fancy, just a modest house with some acreage backing up to a beautiful mix of hardwood forest and swamp. It was always peaceful here. Wildlife passing through occasionally, but nothing out of the ordinary. That all changed last October. See, there's this big timber company that bought up thousands of acres of pine forest about 2 miles from my property. They clear-cut the whole damn thing in just a few weeks. I knew it would disrupt the local wildlife, but I had no idea how much it would change things around here. It started with small stuff, More deer than usual coming onto my property, raccoons getting bolder around the trash cans, that kind of thing. But then I started noticing other disturbances. Wood knocks in the distance, strange vocalizations at night that didn't sound like any animal I recognized. Finding broken branches placed in weird patterns near my property line. Footprints that were too big to be human, but definitely not bear. I'm not some conspiracy nut, I swear. I've lived in rural areas my whole life. I know the sounds of the forest. These were different, and they were getting closer to my house week by week. My dog Rusty felt it too. He's a mutt, about 70 pounds, not afraid of much. But he started getting anxious at night, growling at the tree line across from the house when there was nothing visibly there. He'd refuse to go outside after dark some nights, which was totally out of character. I started doing research, reading about other people's experiences with similar phenomena. I'm still hesitant to use the word Bigfoot because it sounds so ridiculous saying it out loud, but that's where all the evidence was pointing. Those things, whatever they are, had been displaced by the logging and seemed to have moved into my woods. By January, the activity had increased to the point where I could almost set my watch by it. Wood knocks at dusk. Movement along the tree line after midnight, finding my bird feeders completely emptied or sometimes torn down entirely. Then came January 21st. It was unseasonably warm that day, maybe 50 degrees. The sun was setting around 5:30, and I was sitting on my porch with a beer, watching the woods. Rusty was out in the yard, nose to the ground, doing his usual patrol of the property. I don't know what possessed me to do it. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was frustration at having these things encroach on my property for months. But I decided to try to communicate. I'd read online about how they respond to certain vocalizations, so I cupped my hands around my mouth and let out this long, whooping call across the yard toward the forest. The response was immediate. A sharp, loud knock from the tree line. Maybe 100 yards away, it was like someone had taken a baseball bat to a tree trunk. My blood ran cold. This was the first time I'd gotten such a clear, immediate response. Rusty's ears perked up, and before I could call him back, he bolted straight toward the sound, barking his head off. He disappeared into the trees, his barking growing fainter. Then, nothing. Complete silence. My dog, who barks at his own shadow sometimes, had gone completely quiet. My heart dropped into my stomach. "Rusty!" I called out. No response, no barking, no rustling in the underbrush, nothing. I ran inside, grabbed my flashlight, and in what was probably the stupidest decision of my life, headed toward the tree line. I picked up a large fallen branch along the way, about 4 feet long and thick as my wrist. Some pathetic form of protection, looking back on it now. The sun had dipped below the horizon by this point, but there was still some light in the sky, enough to see by, but dark enough that the forest looked like a wall of shadow. I hesitated at the edge of the trees, calling Rusty's name again, still nothing. I took a deep breath and stepped into the forest. The temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees as soon as I was under the canopy. I swept my flashlight across the trees, looking for any sign of my dog. About 50 yards in, I stopped. I was scared, angry, and desperate all at once. I raised the branch I was carrying and struck it hard against the nearest tree trunk. "I want my dog," I shouted, my voice echoing through the trees. "Rusty, where are you, boy?" For a moment, there was nothing. Then, from deeper in the forest came another wood knock, louder this time, deliberate, and then, God, I still get chills thinking about it. The sound of something beating its chest, like a gorilla at the zoo, but deeper, more powerful, followed by the unmistakable sound of something very large moving through the underbrush, moving toward me. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to run, but I was frozen in place. Whatever this thing was, it had my dog. Running might make it chase me. So I did the only thing I could think of. I stood my ground. The movement stopped about 20 yards from me. I couldn't see clearly through the trees, but when I raised my flashlight, I caught a glimpse of eyeshine reflecting back at me, not low to the ground like a coyote or raccoon. This was about 6 feet off the ground, maybe higher. My hand was shaking so badly I could barely hold the flashlight steady. The eyeshine blinked once, slowly. It was watching me, assessing me. I don't know where I found the courage, but I lowered my branch slightly and spoke as calmly as I could. "I just want my dog back," I said, my voice surprisingly steady despite my racing heart. "Give me my dog, and I'll leave your woods alone. I'll go back to my house." The eyeshine remained fixed on me for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 10 or 15 seconds. Then it disappeared, not like whatever it was had closed its eyes, but like it had turned away. I stood there, hardly daring to breathe, straining to hear any sound of movement. There was a soft rustling in the brush, moving away from me, deeper into the forest. Then silence again. I was about to call out for Rusty again when I heard something moving through the underbrush. Something much smaller than whatever had been watching me. A moment later, Rusty burst through the bushes, running straight to me, tail between his legs. I've never been so relieved in my life. I immediately checked him over for injuries, but there wasn't a mark on him. He was trembling, though, and kept looking back over his shoulder as I hurriedly led him back toward the house. We made it back to the porch in record time. Rusty refused to leave my side the rest of the night, whimpering whenever I moved away from him. He wouldn't even go out to pee until the next morning, and even then, he did his business right next to the porch steps and scrambled back inside. Here's the thing that keeps me up at night. Whatever was out there in those woods had caught my dog. Rusty is fast and knows these woods well. For something to catch him and then hold him silent, that's not normal. And after I confronted it, spoke to it directly, it let Rusty go, unharmed, like it understood what I was saying and made a conscious decision to release him. I've spent the last few months trying to rationalize what happened. Maybe it was just a bear, and Rusty got scared into silence. Maybe there was no connection between my words and his return. But deep down, I know better. Whatever was in those woods that night wasn't just an animal acting on instinct. It understood. It made a choice. The activity around my property has decreased since then. I still hear wood knocks occasionally, but they're farther away now, deeper in the swamp. I haven't tried to communicate again. It feels like we've reached some kind of unspoken agreement. They keep their distance, and I keep mine. I've thought about setting up game cameras, gathering evidence, trying to prove what I know is out there. But honestly, I don't want to disturb whatever balance we've struck. They were here first, in a way. The logging pushed them onto my doorstep, but this forest has been here a lot longer than my house has. So that's my story. I still don't know exactly what's living in those woods. I don't know why it took my dog or why it gave him back. All I know is that on January 21st, 2017, I stood face to face with something that wasn't supposed to exist. And somehow both my dog and I walked away unharmed. I haven't told many people about this. Who would believe me? But I know what I experienced. And every time I hear a knock from the woods at dusk, I'm reminded that I'm not alone out here. Story 14. I've held on to this for so long that it feels strange to finally put it into words. Even now, 48 years later, I get this cold sensation in my stomach whenever I think about it. It was October 1975. I was 16, living in Portage-la Prairie, Manitoba. That Sunday evening, I was stuck in my room trying to finish some homework, but I couldn't focus. You know how it is as a teenager. Sometimes you just need to get out, even when it's getting dark. Around 10 o'clock, I decided to take a walk to clear my head. It was one of those cold Manitoba October nights. The wind was picking up, making that hollow sound as it pushed through the trees and between houses. I didn't have any destination in mind, but my feet carried me toward Yellow Quill School, where I'd gone for grade 9. I don't know why I went there. Maybe because it was familiar, maybe just because it was quiet. The school grounds were completely empty. The streetlights cast these long shadows across the football field and the running track that circled it. I remember the crunch of my shoes on the packed dirt as I walked along the track, just listening to the wind and trying to empty my mind of all the algebra equations I'd been struggling with. That's when I saw it. At first, I just thought it was some guy standing at the south end of the track. Even from a distance, though, something seemed off about the silhouette. It was so tall, way taller than any person I'd ever seen. I've always been curious by nature, sometimes stupidly so, and instead of just leaving, I decided to get closer. I wanted to see who would be hanging around the school this late on a Sunday. I moved slowly, trying to stay in the shadows. The closer I got, the more my stomach started to knot up. This wasn't just some tall guy. Whatever was standing there was massive, unnaturally big. But still, I kept going. There was a small electrical transformer box next to the gym that gave me a place to hide while still having a clear view. I crouched behind it, trying to control my breathing, which seemed suddenly loud in the quiet night. The figure was backlit by the distant streetlights, which created this weird outline effect. That's when I realized what was making me so uneasy. This thing, whatever it was, appeared to be naked despite the cold, but it wasn't skin I was seeing. Its entire body was covered in what looked like short, dark hair. My mind immediately flashed to something I'd heard that summer. 2 boys from the Long Plains Indian Reserve, not far from Portage, had reported seeing a large, hairy, man-like creature outside their house. Everyone in town had laughed it off as kids with wild imaginations, or maybe they'd seen a bear. But staring at this figure, those stories didn't seem so funny anymore. The thing was just standing there, swaying slightly from side to side. It wasn't doing anything threatening. It was almost like it was just taking in the night. Maybe listening to the wind, like I had been moments before. I don't think it even noticed me. I stayed frozen behind that transformer, afraid to move. The creature was standing right next to the baseball backstop. You know, those metal cage-like structures behind home plate? This thing stood over 3/4 of the way up it. For reference, those backstops are usually around 10 to 12 feet tall. This meant the creature had to be between 9 and 10 feet tall. It was about half as wide as the small track path it was standing on, which would make it around 3 feet across. The proportions were human-like, but just wrong. Too big, too massive. Its body had this slight taper at the waist, and its head looked somewhat pointed at the top. What really got me were its arms. They hung down so low with hands that dangled slightly below its knees. It stood upright like a human, but there was nothing human about its size. I don't know how long I stayed there watching it. Time seemed to stretch out forever. My legs were cramping from crouching, and I was starting to shiver from both the cold and fear. I knew I needed to leave, but I was terrified that any movement would draw its attention. Finally, I gathered my courage and started to inch backward. I moved as slowly and quietly as possible, keeping my eyes fixed on the creature the whole time. Once I had put some distance between us, I carefully made my way around the north end of the high school building, using it as cover. As soon as I was out of sight, I ran. I ran faster than I ever had before, all the way home. My lungs were burning and my legs felt like jelly, but the fear pushed me forward. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see that massive figure lumbering after me, but the streets remained empty. When I got home, I locked the door behind me and went straight to my room. I was breathing so hard I thought my parents might hear and come check on me, but thankfully, they didn't. I sat on my bed, still in my jacket, trying to make sense of what I'd seen. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that figure standing there, swaying in the wind. Every creak of the house made me jolt awake. By morning, I was exhausted, but I had this overwhelming need to go back to the school to see if there was any evidence of what I'd witnessed. As soon as it was light out, I went back to the track. I told my parents I needed to meet a friend to study before school. The morning was clear and cold, nothing like the eerie, windswept scene from the night before. In the daylight, everything seemed so normal, so ordinary. I went to the spot where the creature had been standing and examined the ground carefully. All I found were some scuff marks in the hard-packed sand. They weren't distinct footprints, just areas where the surface had been disturbed. They could have been made by anything. People playing sports, animals, anything. There was nothing definitive to confirm what I'd seen. I was both disappointed and relieved. Part of me wanted proof that I hadn't imagined it, while another part hoped desperately that I had. I told very few people about what happened. The first person I confided in, a close friend, laughed and suggested I'd seen the school janitor or maybe a homeless person. Others weren't much better. One suggested I'd been watching too many scary movies, another that I was making it up for attention. After a while, I just stopped talking about it, but I couldn't stop thinking about it. I started paying attention to local news, especially around the Long Plains Indian Reserve. Occasionally, farmers in the area would report weird sightings, livestock acting strange, unusual noises at night, large shadowy figures at the edge of fields. Most people blamed it on bears, wolves, or just overactive imaginations. A few older folks would sometimes mention Sasquatch, but they'd get the same dismissive reactions I did. After all, wasn't Bigfoot supposed to be in the mountains, not on the flat plains around Portage-la-Prairie? For years after, I couldn't go near that school at night. Even during the day, I'd get this crawling sensation up my spine whenever I passed the track. I'd find myself scanning the tree line, looking for that massive silhouette. Sometimes on windy nights, I'd wake up convinced I could hear heavy footsteps outside my window. I'm in my 60s now, and I've traveled all over Canada. I've been in the densest forests of British Columbia, hiked through the Rockies, explored remote parts of northern Manitoba. I've encountered bears, wolves, moose, all manner of wildlife. Nothing I've ever seen in all those years comes close to matching what I saw that night in Portage-la-Prairie. I still don't know what it was. Logic tells me there must be some explanation. Maybe it was just a very tall person. Maybe the darkness and wind played tricks on my eyes. But deep down, I know what I saw. I know how it made me feel. That primal fear. That sense of being in the presence of something that shouldn't exist in our world, but somehow does. Sometimes I wonder if it's still out there, still roaming the plains around Portage-la-Prairie. I wonder if other people have seen it over the years, but like me, kept quiet out of fear of ridicule. All I know for sure is that whatever I saw that night wasn't human, and it wasn't any animal I recognized. It moved with this strange purpose, like it belonged there more than I did. And sometimes when the wind picks up at night and makes that hollow sound, I can't help but think it's calling to something. Something tall and hairy that sways in the darkness at the edge of town, watching and waiting. Story 15. I still can't believe what I saw that summer evening in 1979. I was 14 years old, spending July at my mother's family homestead near Boyle, Alberta. It's been over 40 years. But I remember every detail like it was yesterday. Sometimes I wish I could forget. It was a perfect Alberta summer day, clear blue skies, not too hot, just beautiful. We'd spent the afternoon at the lake with a bunch of relatives and some family friends. Around 6 in the evening, my buddy Mike suggested we head back to the farm early on his dirt bike while the adults packed up. I jumped at the chance. Riding that bike was always a highlight of my visits. The route back to the farm was mostly gravel roads, cutting through dense forest and farmland. About 2/3 of the way there, there's this long straight stretch before you hit a hard right turn that leads to the final approach to the homestead. After that turn, it's still about 2 miles to reach the actual farm. Mike was driving with me, holding onto his waist from behind. The bike was loud, one of those old two-strokes that screamed like a banshee, and the wind was whipping past my ears. We were just cruising, enjoying the ride, dust kicking up behind us. We'd just hit that long straightaway when I noticed something in the distance. At first glance, it looked like a person walking down the middle of the road, maybe a mile ahead of us. Nothing alarming about that. Could have been a neighbor or someone taking a walk, but as we got closer, something felt off. The figure seemed darker than it should have been, and bigger, way bigger than any person I knew. I remember squinting, thinking maybe the sun was playing tricks on my eyes or something, but the closer we got, the more wrong it looked. This thing was massive, tall and broad, and the way it was walking was strange, almost like it was swinging its arms more than a normal person would. I tried to get Mike's attention, tapping his shoulder and pointing, but the bike was too loud. He couldn't hear anything I was saying. I was getting more and more freaked out as we approached. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. We were getting closer and closer to this thing. It was walking away from us in the same direction we were headed. At this point I could see it was covered in dark hair or fur, not clothes. It was at least 7 feet tall, maybe taller, with really long arms. The back of my neck was tingling, and I had goosebumps all over despite the warm evening. Just before the turn that would take us to the farm, Mike suddenly hit the brakes. The bike skidded slightly on the gravel, and we came to an abrupt stop about 200 yards from the figure. Mike killed the engine, and in the sudden silence, I could hear birds chirping and the wind in the trees, and nothing else. The figure was still walking, seemingly unaware of us. "Do you see what I'm seeing?" I whispered to Mike, my voice shaking. Mike nodded, his face pale. "Yeah, what is it?" he whispered back. Right at that moment, as if it heard us despite the distance, the thing stopped walking. It just froze in place for a second or two. Then it turned its head, not its whole body, just its head, slightly toward us. I couldn't make out a face, just a dark mass where a face should be. That's when things got truly terrifying. The creature suddenly crouched down low, almost like a football player ready to sprint. It stayed like that for maybe 5 seconds, though it felt like an eternity. And then it moved. God, the way it moved. It didn't run like a human. It scrambled, almost on all fours, but not quite. It was this weird, fluid motion as it darted off the road into the ditch and then into the thick brush alongside. The bushes shook violently as it disappeared, and then everything was still again, completely still. Even the birds had stopped chirping. Until that moment, some part of my brain had been desperately trying to convince me it was just a person, maybe someone in dark clothes, maybe someone unusually tall. But no person moves like that. No person goes from walking upright to that animal-like scramble in seconds. No person that size could move that quickly. I felt lightheaded, like I might pass out right there on the back of the bike. My whole body went cold, then hot, then cold again. I remember gripping Mike's jacket so hard my knuckles hurt. Mike didn't say a word. He just kicked the bike to life and gunned it, accelerating so fast I almost fell off the back. I grabbed him tighter and we tore down that road, taking the right turn so sharply that the back tire skidded. The whole time, I kept looking back over my shoulder, terrified that thing was going to burst out of the trees and chase us. We covered those last 2 miles to the farm in what felt like seconds. Neither of us said a word the whole way. When we pulled into the yard, Mike practically dumped the bike on its side and we both ran for the house. My legs were so shaky I stumbled twice. Once inside, we locked the door behind us, something nobody ever did out there. Then we just looked at each other, both breathing hard. "What the hell was that?" I finally managed to ask. Mike shook his head. "I don't know, man. I don't know." Something primal took over then. Without even discussing it, we went straight to the gun cabinet. Mike's grandfather kept several rifles and shotguns for hunting and predator control. We took out 2 shotguns and a rifle, loading them with shaking hands. Then we went out to the woodpile and started building a bonfire in the fire pit, a much bigger one than we'd normally make. It wasn't even dark yet, but some deep instinct told us we needed light, and lots of it. By the time we had the fire blazing, we still hadn't really talked about what we'd seen. It was like we were afraid saying it out loud would make it more real, or maybe we were worried the other person would think we were crazy. So we just kept busy, piling more wood on the fire, checking the guns, pacing around the yard. I remember standing there, staring down the driveway, half expecting to see that thing come lumbering toward us. The shotgun felt heavy and unfamiliar in my hands. I'd fired one before, but only at targets, never at anything living, and certainly not at whatever that was. About an hour later, we heard the cars coming up the drive. The rest of our families had finally arrived from the lake. I felt this wave of relief wash over me when they pulled into the yard. My Uncle Jim was the first one out of his truck. He took one look at us, standing there with the guns and the huge fire, and demanded to know what was going on. Mike and I exchanged glances. Now came the hard part, trying to explain. We told them what we'd seen. I could tell from their faces they didn't believe us. Not really. They thought we'd seen a bear or maybe a moose, but both Mike and I knew the difference. This thing had been walking on two legs, upright like a man, until it wasn't. No bear walks like that. No moose has those proportions. My uncle took the shotgun from my hands, telling me to calm down. The adults all shared these looks, like the kids got spooked by something and overreacted. They humored us, though. Let us keep the bonfire going all night. Let us stay up later than usual. Probably thought it would help us settle down. I barely slept that night. Every sound from the woods had me sitting bolt upright. I kept seeing that thing in my mind. The way it moved, the unnatural quickness of it, the sheer size. The next morning, Mike and I rode his dirt bike back to the spot. In the daylight, it seemed ridiculous to be afraid, but we still brought one of the rifles just in case. We searched the ditch and the edge of the woods where the thing had disappeared. The ground was too hard and dry to show footprints on the road, but in the softer earth of the ditch, we found something. Depressions in the ground. Not clear footprints, but definitely something large had disturbed the area. The grass was flattened in a path leading into the woods. We followed it for maybe 20 yards before losing the trail in the denser underbrush. Neither of us wanted to go any deeper into the forest. Over the next few days, I started asking around, cautiously at first, just casual questions to the local farmers and my older relatives. Ever see anything strange in the woods around here? To my surprise, I wasn't met with the ridicule I expected. Instead, there were these knowing looks. Half-told stories cut short when they realized how intently I was listening. References to things seen at dusk or dawn, at the edges of fields or on lonely stretches of road. Never anything specific, never anything they'd admit to outright. But enough to tell me that what Mike and I saw wasn't unique. One afternoon, I rode into Athabasca with my uncle to get supplies. While he was loading feed into the truck, I slipped into the local newspaper office. I asked the lady at the desk if I could look at their archives, making up some story about a school project. She seemed skeptical, but let me browse through the bound volumes of old papers. It took some digging, but I found what I was looking for. Over the years, there had been several reports of strange sightings in the area. A farmer finding huge, human-like footprints crossing his field. Hunters describing weird sounds in the forest, too deep to be a person calling out. A truck driver who claimed something tall and hairy crossed the highway in front of him late one night. The articles were always small, tucked away on inner pages. Most treated the stories with skepticism, but they were there. When we left to go back to the city at the end of July, I was almost relieved. Being back in Edmonton, surrounded by concrete and streetlights, made it easier to convince myself that what we'd seen had a rational explanation. Mike and I never really talked about it again after that summer. It was like we had this unspoken agreement to let it fade away. But it never did, not completely. To this day, I can close my eyes and see that figure on the road. The unnatural way it moved, the impossible quickness as it vanished into the brush. I've read about Bigfoot sightings since then. Some of the descriptions match what we saw, some don't. I don't know what to call what we encountered that day. I just know that it was real and that it fundamentally changed how I see the world. There are things out there, in the quiet places, in the spaces between towns that don't fit into our neat categories of what should exist. The official time on my watch was 6:45 when we saw it. A clear, sunny summer evening. Perfect visibility. No alcohol or drugs involved. Just two teenagers on a dirt bike who saw something that shouldn't exist but did. Sometimes I think about going back to that stretch of road I never have. I'm not sure if it's because I'm afraid I'll see it again or because I'm afraid I won't. Ditiki, Story 16. I still can't fully explain what happened to us that day, and it's been bothering me for nearly a decade now. I've gone over it countless times in my head, trying to make sense of it, but I keep coming back to the same unsettling conclusion. It was June 2nd, 2013, a Sunday that started like any other weekend adventure. My buddy, I'll call him Mark, had this beat-up Jeep Wrangler that we'd take out exploring the logging roads in the mountains about 40 minutes from where we lived. Nothing fancy, just two guys in their 20s with nothing better to do than drive through the woods, have a few beers, and get away from everything for a while. That particular Sunday was perfect weather. Not too hot, clear skies, just enough breeze to keep the bugs away. We'd packed some sandwiches, drinks, and my camera. I'd recently gotten into photography and wanted to capture some of the views from up in the hills. We'd been driving for about an hour and a half, going deeper into the network of logging roads than we usually did. Mark was confident his Jeep could handle whatever we came across, even though we both knew these back roads could get rough. The further we went, the narrower and less maintained the roads became, with branches scraping against the sides of the Jeep and rocks underneath giving us a good bounce every few seconds. Around 1 o'clock in the afternoon, we came around a bend and found our path blocked by two fallen trees that had somehow managed to cross each other as they fell, creating this perfect barricade across the main road. They weren't huge, maybe 8 or 10 inches in diameter, but definitely too big to move ourselves and too high for the Jeep to climb over. Mark pulled up close and we got out to take a look. The trees didn't look like they'd been there long. The leaves were still green and the break points looked fresh, not weathered. What struck me as odd was that there hadn't been any storms recently that could have knocked them down. "Well, that's the end of this road," Mark said, kicking at one of the trunks. I noticed a narrower side road branching off to our right, disappearing into denser forest. "What about that one?" I suggested, pointing. Mark squinted down the path. "Looks pretty overgrown, but we could check it out." We decided to leave the Jeep parked by the fallen trees and explore the side path on foot, since it didn't look wide enough for the vehicle anyway. I grabbed my camera and Mark took his hunting knife. Not that we expected trouble, but we'd both grown up with dads who taught us never to go into the woods unprepared. We'd only walked maybe 10 feet down this narrower path when we heard it, 3 quick, deliberate knocks coming from the trees to our right. It sounded exactly like someone taking a heavy stick and striking it against a tree trunk. Knock, 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 evenly spaced, unmistakably intentional. We both froze. Mark looked at me with raised eyebrows. "Did you hear that?" I whispered. He nodded. "Woodpecker." I shook my head. Too loud, too spaced out. We stood perfectly still for a minute, listening. Nothing but the normal forest sounds, distant birds, the rustle of leaves in the breeze. "Probably just a branch falling," Mark said finally, but he didn't sound convinced. We continued down the path, a bit more alert now. After another few hundred yards, the path opened into a small clearing where we found something unexpected. Abandoned logging equipment. There was an old skidder, the kind used to drag cut logs, and what looked like parts of a portable sawmill. The equipment was rusted and obviously had been there for years, half swallowed by vegetation. "Weird they'd just leave this here," I said, running my hand along the skidder's frame. "There's good money in scrap metal." Mark was examining the ground around the equipment. "Looks like they just up and left one day. Never came back for any of it." I was taking photos of the abandoned machinery when we heard it again. The same 3 distinct knocks, but this time from behind us, back toward the way we'd come. The sounds were unmistakable, and there was no question now that they were deliberate. Knock, knock, knock. The hairs on my neck stood up. I turned in the direction of the sound and raised my camera, zooming in to see if I could spot anything through the trees. Through the viewfinder, I scanned the forest line but couldn't make out anything unusual, just trees, undergrowth, shadows. But when I lowered the camera and looked at the display to review the shots I'd just taken, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off about them, like maybe there was something there that my eyes couldn't quite process. "Let's check it out," Mark said, starting to walk back toward the knocking sounds. I wasn't eager to, but I followed him anyway. We'd gone maybe 20 yards back down the path when we heard another sound, this time from our left, deeper in the forest. It wasn't knocking this time. It was a massive crack, like a thick limb breaking under tremendous strain. But what followed was even stranger, a progressive splitting noise, like when a tree is being felled but takes its time going down, with the wood fibers tearing apart bit by bit. We both stopped dead in our tracks. That wasn't a natural sound, at least not entirely. Trees do fall in forests all the time, but the progression of this one, the timing right after we'd started moving toward the knocks, it felt orchestrated. "Mark," I said quietly, "I think we should head back to the Jeep." For once, he didn't argue with me or call me a wimp. His face had gone a shade paler, and he just nodded. We turned around and started walking back, not running, but definitely moving faster than before. As we reached the edge of the clearing with the abandoned equipment, I heard something that made my blood run cold, a deep, rumbling breath from somewhere in the trees to our right. It wasn't loud, but in the relative quiet of the forest, it carried. It sounded huge, like something with lungs 3 times the size of mine. Mark heard it too. Our eyes met, and without a word, we both broke into a jog, not a full-out, panicked run, but fast enough that we were back at the fallen trees and the Jeep within minutes. Once back at the vehicle, Mark climbed up on the hood to get a better vantage point. He scanned the forest with a pair of compact binoculars he kept in the glove compartment. "See anything?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "Nothing moving," he replied, still scanning. "Wait. There's some flattened undergrowth over there." He pointed to an area about 50 yards away, where the denser forest began. Like something big passed through recently, I climbed up next to him, and he handed me the binoculars. I could see what he was talking about, a swath of ferns and small plants that looked pressed down, creating what almost looked like a path leading deeper into the woods. "Could be deer," I suggested half-heartedly. "Pretty wide for deer," Mark responded, "and deer don't knock on trees." We got back in the Jeep, and Mark started the engine. Neither of us spoke as we turned around and headed back the way we'd come. It wasn't until we'd gone several miles back onto the wider, more maintained logging roads that we started to discuss what had happened. "Those knocks weren't natural," Mark said, gripping the steering wheel tightly. "They were communication." "From what, though?" I asked. "Rangers? Other hikers?" Mark shook his head. "Rangers would have just called out to us. And why would hikers be knocking on trees instead of, just saying hello?" "Maybe it was an animal," I suggested, though I didn't believe it myself. The precision and deliberateness of those knocks, 3 in a row, perfectly spaced, didn't match any animal behavior I was familiar with. "The thing that really gets me," Mark said after a while, "is that tree breaking. That wasn't a coincidence. Whatever made that sound, it did it right after we started heading toward the knocks, like it was trying to distract us or scare us off." I nodded, remembering the progression of the crack, that initial break, followed by the tearing sound. "And it worked," I said. "When we got back to town, we stopped at a local diner for a late lunch, though neither of us had much appetite. We tried to rationalize what we'd experienced. Maybe it was other people messing with us. Maybe it was some combination of natural sounds that just seemed orchestrated. But deep down, I knew better." Those knocks were too perfect, too deliberate. And that breathing sound, I still hear it sometimes when I'm trying to fall asleep. I've gone back through the photos I took that day countless times. Most are just shots of the abandoned equipment and the forest. But there's one that I took when I was scanning the trees after hearing the second set of knocks. Most of the frame is just foliage and tree trunks, but at the edge, partially obscured by branches, there's what looks like a dark shape. It's probably just shadows, a trick of the light. At least that's what I tell myself. But when I zoom in, the shape seems to have a form, a solidity that shadows shouldn't have. I've never gone back to that particular area, though Mark says he did a few months later with a couple of other friends. They found the fallen trees still blocking the road, but when they tried to find the side path we'd taken, they couldn't locate it. Mark swears it was like the forest had swallowed it up. I've researched tree knocking since then, and found that it's associated with Bigfoot sightings. 3 knocks specifically are reported by people who claim to have encountered these creatures. I'm not saying that's what we experienced. Honestly, I don't know what to think. But what I do know is that the sounds we heard that day weren't typical wildlife, weren't other humans, and definitely weren't my imagination. Sometimes I think about going back, better prepared, to see if I can make sense of what happened. But then I remember that deep, rumbling breath, and I decide some mysteries are better left unsolved. Whatever was in those woods that day was watching us, communicating somehow, and made it very clear that we weren't welcome to go any further, and I, for one, am perfectly fine respecting that boundary. Story 17. I've gone back and forth about whether I should share this, but I need to get it off my chest. It's been haunting me since it happened back in 2006, and maybe writing it down will help me make sense of it. It was late October, and my hunting partner and I were up near Heart Lake. We'd been after this one particular buck for 3 years straight, a massive 10-pointer that always seemed to outsmart us. This was our 6th day camped out there, and honestly we were getting discouraged. The temperatures had dropped significantly that week, and the mountains were eerily quiet most days. That evening, everything changed. We were heading back to camp before dark, maybe around 5:30 or so. The sun was getting low, casting long shadows across the valley. We still had about 2 miles to go when we heard it, a sound I'll never forget as long as I live. It was this deep, bellowing howl that echoed across the entire valley. I've spent my whole life in these mountains. I know what coyotes sound like. I know what wolves sound like. I know what mountain lions sound like when they scream. This wasn't any of those. This sound was primal, deep. It settled right in my chest like a physical weight. I stopped dead in my tracks, and my partner did the same thing at the exact same moment. We just looked at each other. I remember his face going pale. Neither of us said anything for a few seconds. What was there to say? We both knew we'd never heard anything like that before. I finally broke the silence with, "What the hell was that?" He just shook his head, looking around nervously. We picked up our pace, both of us suddenly very aware of how far we were from camp and how quickly the daylight was fading. We'd covered maybe a 1/4 mile when we heard it again. That same bellowing howl, but closer this time, much closer, and there was something about it, something that made the hair on the back of my neck stand straight up. It had this edge to it, like a challenge or a warning. We both instinctively turned toward where the sound was coming from, the ridge to our west, maybe 500 yards away. That's when we spotted the buck we'd been hunting all this time. He was bolting down the opposite side of the ridge, crashing through brush like his life depended on it. I've seen deer run from predators before, but never like this. This wasn't a casual trot away from danger. This was blind panic. My partner was raising his binoculars when I noticed something else. There was a silhouette standing on the ridge above where the deer had just been. At first glance, I thought it was a bear standing on its hind legs. We get a lot of black bears in that area, and occasionally a grizzly wanders through. But something wasn't right about the shape. I unslung my rifle and looked through my scope. The magnification gave me a clearer view, and my stomach dropped. It wasn't a bear. This thing was tall, really tall, and standing fully upright. It had long limbs and a bulky upper body. For a split second I thought maybe it was another hunter in some kind of ghillie suit or camouflage gear, but the proportions were all wrong. The arms hung too low, the shoulders were too broad, and the head seemed to sit directly on the shoulders without much of a neck. It stood there for maybe 10 seconds, completely still, looking in the direction the deer had run. Then it turned and seemed to look directly toward us. I swear, even at that distance, I felt like it was staring right at me through my scope. Then it turned and moved away, disappearing into the tree line with a gait that was definitely not human. Long, fluid strides that covered ground impossibly fast. My partner lowered his binoculars. "Did you see that?" he whispered, like whatever it was might hear us from that distance. I nodded, my mouth too dry to speak right away. "That wasn't a bear," I finally managed to say. "No," he agreed. "It sure as hell wasn't." We stood there for a moment, both of us processing what we'd just seen. The logical part of my brain was working overtime, trying to find a rational explanation, but coming up short. "We should check it out," I said, though every instinct was screaming at me to head back to camp as fast as possible. My partner looked at me like I was insane. "Are you serious? We're hunters, aren't we? Let's at least see if we can figure out what it was." I don't know why I suggested it. Curiosity, I guess. Or maybe I needed to prove to myself that there was a logical explanation for what we'd seen. Either way, we cautiously made our way up toward the ridge where the figure had been standing. The sun was getting dangerously low now, giving us maybe 45 minutes of decent light left. It took us about 20 minutes to reach the spot. The ground was hard-packed dirt with patches of pine needles and scattered rocks. At first, we didn't see anything unusual. Then my partner called me over. "Look at this," he said, pointing to the ground. What I saw made my blood run cold. There in the dirt was a footprint, if you could even call it that. It made my size 12 boot look like it belonged to a toddler. This thing was massive, at least 16 inches long and incredibly wide. I could clearly see toe impressions at the front, 5 of them, spaced differently than a human foot would be. The heel was long and wide, and the midfoot had a distinctive arch to it. I've been tracking animals my whole life. I know what bear tracks look like, what moose tracks look like, what every animal native to these mountains leaves behind. This wasn't any of them, and it wasn't a human print either. No shoe treads or boot patterns, just a bare, enormous foot impression that suggested a stride length that would have been impossible for a human. There were more tracks leading away into the trees. They showed a creature with an enormous stride length, easily twice what a tall human could manage. The impressions were deep too, suggesting something extremely heavy. "We need to get back to camp," my partner said, his voice shaking slightly. For the first time since I'd known him, I heard real fear in his voice. I nodded, suddenly very aware of the fading light and how exposed we were. We headed back down the ridge, moving faster than was probably safe on the uneven terrain. Neither of us wanted to be out there after dark. We'd made it about halfway back to camp when we heard the howl again. This time it was behind us, from the direction we'd just come. My partner and I exchanged glances and wordlessly picked up our pace, almost jogging now. The sun had nearly set, with just a faint glow on the western horizon. The forest around us was getting dark, the shadows between the trees deepening to black. Every sound seemed amplified, the crunch of pine needles under our boots, the rustle of wind through the branches, our own increasingly heavy breathing. About a mile from camp, I heard something that made me stop in my tracks. It was a sound like heavy footfalls, moving through the forest parallel to our path. It wasn't matching our pace exactly. It was moving in bursts, stopping occasionally, then moving again, like it was pacing us. "Do you hear that?" I whispered. My partner nodded, his face barely visible in the dimming light. "It's following us." We picked up our pace again, now fully jogging despite the danger of tripping on the uneven ground. The footfalls kept pace, sometimes getting closer, sometimes falling back, but always there in the periphery of our hearing. Then came a smell, a powerful, musky odor that hit us like a wall. It was like wet dog mixed with something rotting, but stronger than anything I'd ever encountered. It was so intense it made my eyes water. "Jesus Christ," my partner hissed, pulling his shirt up over his nose. The smell lingered for maybe 30 seconds, then was gone as quickly as it had appeared, as if whatever was producing it had moved downwind. We were maybe a quarter mile from camp when we heard brush cracking to our right. Something large was moving through the forest, not bothering to be quiet anymore. It was close, maybe 50 yards away, but hidden by the dense trees and the growing darkness. I raised my rifle instinctively, though I knew I couldn't shoot at something I couldn't clearly identify. My partner had his shotgun ready too, both of us scanning the tree line frantically. The movement stopped. For several long seconds there was complete silence. No birds, no insects, nothing, just the sound of our own breathing and heartbeats. Then came a low, rumbling growl from the darkness, not like any animal I've ever heard. It had depth to it, almost like it contained words, but nothing recognizable as human language. "Run," my partner whispered. "Now." We sprinted the last quarter mile to camp, careening through the forest like madmen, branches slapping at our faces and arms. I don't know if whatever it was chased us. I was too terrified to look back. We burst into the clearing where our camp was set up, both of us gasping for breath. The campfire had burned down to embers, casting just enough light to make out our tent and gear. We quickly built the fire back up, working in silent, frantic cooperation until we had a roaring blaze going. Only when we had the fire blazing did I realize how badly my hands were shaking. My partner wasn't in much better shape. We sat by the fire with our weapons across our laps, scanning the darkness beyond the circle of firelight. "What the hell was that?" my partner finally asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I shook my head. I don't know, but some part of me did know, or at least suspected. I just couldn't bring myself to say it out loud. It seemed too absurd, too impossible. We heard occasional movement in the forest around our camp throughout the night. Once or twice I caught glimpses of something moving just at the edge of the firelight. Something large and dark that moved with unnerving grace for its size. We took turns staying awake, neither of us willing to sleep at the same time. The howling came 3 more times during the night. Each time, it seemed to come from a different direction, as if whatever was out there was circling our camp, testing our perimeter. Each time we heard it, my partner and I would lock eyes across the fire, unspoken fear passing between us. Around 3 in the morning, I was on watch while my partner dozed fitfully. The fire had died down a bit, and I was just about to add more wood when I saw it. At the very edge of the firelight, maybe 30 yards away, standing between 2 large pines, was a figure. It was massive, easily 7 or 8 feet tall, with broad shoulders and long arms that hung almost to its knees. It was covered in what looked like dark fur or hair, matted in places, but it was the eyes that got me, reflective in the firelight like an animal's, but set in a face that, while not human, wasn't entirely animal either. The face had a pronounced brow ridge and what looked like a flattened nose, but with distinctly humanoid features around the jaw and mouth. It stood there, perfectly still, watching me. I slowly reached for my rifle, trying not to make any sudden movements. The creature's eyes tracked my hand. It knew exactly what I was doing. Just as my fingers closed around the rifle's stock, it made a sound, a low, huffing grunt, and then it was gone, melting back into the darkness so quickly and silently that I questioned if I'd actually seen it at all. I didn't sleep a wink the rest of the night. At first light, we packed up camp in record time and hiked out of there, not even bothering to look for the buck we'd spent days tracking. Neither of us wanted to spend another minute in those woods. We've never been back to Heart Lake since then. My partner and I don't talk about what happened that night. The few times I've tried to bring it up, he changes the subject or makes some joke to deflect. But sometimes I catch him looking back over his shoulder when we're out in the woods, scanning the tree line with wary eyes. I still hunt, but never alone and never in that area, and I always make sure to be back at camp well before dark. Some things just can't be explained, and maybe they're better left that way. But I know what I saw and what I heard, and I know that something is out there in those mountains, something that isn't supposed to exist. Story 18. I still don't have an explanation for what happened at my mother's place back in January. I've gone over it 1,000 times in my head, and nothing makes sense. I'm not the type to believe in monsters or cryptids, but what I saw that day has seriously messed with my understanding of what's possible. It had snowed pretty heavily the night before, that perfect powdery kind that blankets everything. I was staying with my mom for the weekend, just a casual visit. Her place is pretty isolated, sitting on about 5 acres with dense woods surrounding the back half of the property. I've always loved it there, especially in winter when everything gets quiet and still. That morning, I'd been lounging around, drinking coffee and scrolling through my phone when my mom called from the back door. There was something weird in her voice. Not exactly panic, but definitely concern. "Hey, you need to come see this," she called out. "Right now. When your mother uses that tone, you move." I threw on my boots without lacing them and grabbed my coat off the hook by the door. The cold hit me immediately as I stepped outside. "What's wrong?" I asked, pulling my coat tighter. Mom just pointed toward the edge of the yard where it meets the tree line. "Look at that. Tell me I'm not seeing things." At first I didn't understand what she was showing me. Then I saw them, footprints in the snow, but not normal footprints. These were enormous, and they were clearly made by bare feet. I walked closer, my own boots crunching through the fresh snow. The prints were perfectly preserved in the snow conditions. It had softened slightly during the previous afternoon, and then frozen solid overnight, creating these perfect impressions. "What the hell?" I whispered, kneeling down beside one. The print was massive, easily 15 to 18 inches long, maybe 8 inches across at the widest point. I could clearly make out 5 toe impressions at the front, splayed out slightly like someone who never wears shoes. The arch of the foot was defined, the heel broad and heavy. These weren't animal tracks, they were human-shaped feet, just impossibly large. "They go all the way around the house," Mom said quietly. "I noticed them when I let the dog out this morning. He wouldn't go past the porch, just kept barking." I stood up and looked where she was pointing. Sure enough, the tracks formed a perimeter around the entire property, like whatever made them had been circling the house. "Maybe it's a prank," I suggested, not believing it myself. "Someone with those big fake feet things?" Mom shook her head. "Look at the depth and the detail. Someone would have to weigh hundreds of pounds to make prints that deep." She was right. Each footprint sank several inches into the snow, and the weight distribution looked natural, heavier at the heel, lighter at the toes. No costume feet would create that kind of natural pressure pattern. "Let's follow them," I said, feeling a strange mix of curiosity and dread. We followed the trail around the side of the house. The stride between footprints was enormous, easily 3 feet between left and right foot. I'm 6 feet tall with a decent stride, and I had to stretch uncomfortably to match the distance. "No one could walk like this," Mom said, voicing what I was thinking. "Especially not barefoot in the snow. They'd freeze." The tracks continued in a perfect circle around the property before veering off toward the woods behind the house. Something about their deliberate pattern was deeply unsettling, like whatever made them had been studying the house, looking for a way in. When we reached the tree line, I stopped cold. 3 days earlier, I'd taken a walk through these same woods after a lighter snowfall, Now these massive bare footprints walked directly over my own tracks in several places. The thing had followed my exact path in sections, its huge feet completely obliterating my bootprints. "It followed where I walked," I said quietly. Mom didn't respond, but I could feel her tense beside me. The tracks continued into the woods, never breaking stride, never showing any sign of difficulty navigating the rough terrain. Whatever made these was powerful enough to maintain a consistent gait through deep snow and underbrush. We stopped at the edge of the trees. I wasn't eager to follow the prints into the dense woods, and neither was Mom. Something about those prints made my skin crawl. They were too deliberate, too confident. "Let's get something to measure them," I suggested, partly to have an excuse to go back to the house. Inside, I grabbed a tape measure and my phone to take pictures. When we returned to the prints, I carefully measured several of them. The largest was just over 18 inches long and 8 inches wide. I took several photos, making sure to place my glove next to one for scale. My hand looked child-sized in comparison. "What could possibly make prints like these?" Mom asked, her breath visible in the cold air. I shook my head. "I have no idea." We spent the next hour following the tracks, trying to make sense of them. The creature had walked the perimeter of the house twice, then followed my old trail through part of the woods, before branching off deeper into the forest, where the undergrowth became too dense for us to follow easily. At one point, I found where it had stopped near the living room window. The snow there was disturbed, as if it had stood in place, possibly looking inside. The thought of something that size standing outside while we slept made my stomach turn. "We should call someone," Mom suggested as we headed back to the house. "The police or, I don't know, a wildlife expert?" I nodded, but I knew how it would sound. Giant barefoot prints in the snow, they'll think we're crazy. Still, I called the local sheriff's department. The deputy who answered sounded skeptical but said he'd send someone out. 2 hours later, a young deputy arrived, looking bored and slightly annoyed at being sent out for what he clearly thought was nothing. His expression changed when he saw the prints. "I've never seen anything like this," he admitted, kneeling down to examine them. He took some photos and measurements of his own, his face growing more serious by the minute. "Could be a hoax," he suggested, but without much conviction. "But it would be one hell of an elaborate one." He called it in, and about an hour later, another officer arrived, older and more experienced. They discussed the prints in hushed tones, occasionally glancing back at the house or toward the tree line. Eventually, the older officer approached us. "We'll file a report, but honestly, there's not much we can do. No crime has been committed." "So what made the prints?" Mom pressed. The officer shrugged. "Could be lots of things. Might be kids playing a prank. Might be, well, I don't know what else it might be, but we'll increase patrols in the area for a few days." That was it. They left, and Mom and I were alone again with the mysterious footprints. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about those prints and whatever had made them, the precision of them, the way they circled the house, the way they had followed my own trail through the woods. It felt intentional, intelligent. Around 2 in the morning, I heard something outside, a heavy crunch in the snow, followed by silence, then another crunch closer to the house. I froze in bed, straining to hear. The intervals between sounds matched the stride length of those prints. Something large was moving around outside, taking its time, deliberate and slow. I slipped out of bed and moved to the window, careful not to make a sound. The moon was bright enough to illuminate the yard, casting long shadows from the trees. I scanned the property, looking for movement. At first, I saw nothing. Then, at the edge of the tree line, something moved. It was tall, impossibly tall, maybe 7 or 8 feet, and broad across the shoulders. It stood perfectly still, just watching the house. From that distance, in the darkness, I couldn't make out details. Just a large, dark silhouette against the snow-covered trees. I reached for my phone to take a picture, but by the time I turned back to the window, it was gone. No movement, no trace, just empty woods and moonlit snow. I spent the rest of the night sitting by the window, watching. I never saw it again, but twice more I heard those heavy footsteps circling the house, always keeping just out of sight. When morning came, I immediately went outside to look for fresh prints. There were none. The snow had partially melted during the night and refrozen, destroying any new evidence. The old prints from the day before were still visible, but faded and less distinct. Mom and I spent one more day at the house before I had to head back to the city for work. Neither of us mentioned what had happened much after that first day. It was like we both wanted to pretend it hadn't occurred, to file it away under unexplained and move on. But I can't stop thinking about it. About those precisely placed, enormous bare footprints in the freezing snow. About that tall figure standing at the edge of the woods, watching the house. About the way it had tracked my path through the forest days earlier, stepping exactly where I had stepped. I've researched everything I can think of. Local wildlife, hoaxes, even the ridiculous Bigfoot stories. Nothing fits perfectly. Whatever left those prints was too heavy for a person, too precise for an animal, and too deliberate in its actions to be random. Sometimes when I visit Mom now, I find myself staring out at those woods, wondering if it's still out there, watching, waiting, following our movements. I've started avoiding the forest entirely. I don't know what was circling her house that January night, but I do know this. Whatever it wasn't anything that should exist in our world, and the thought that it might still be out there keeps me awake at night.